Chapter 782. Two balls made of white pellets rolled silently to the feet of the onlookers. It was unknown who had accidentally stepped on these two balls and crushed them into pieces. Those people didn't care. They thought they just stepped on a smoked egg that fell from a table. However, the stench that was as foul as rotten eggs that popped up and the thick smoke that was surging out made the entire devil's stomach seethe. "What's going on?" "Ugh, run out." The drinkers who were watching the fight immediately exploded. They ignored Numun and Kurian, who were fighting for their lives, and rushed to the door of the tavern. Under the barbaric impact of the customers, the swing door at the entrance of the tavern was squeezed down and fell to the ground. As a beast, Kurian's sense of smell was undoubtedly much more sensitive than normal people. Therefore, the foul air was even more lethal to him. After accidentally inhaling a mouthful of gas, he vomited directly and couldn't even stand up straight. Numun didn't look good either. However, he still picked up his weapon nimbly and was ready to take advantage of the chaos to end his opponent and win the final victory of this fight. But just as he was about to wave the giant axe, a powerful palm grabbed his arm. Seeing the killing intent in Numun's eyes, the person who stopped him quickly said, "Friend, we have no other malice. We just want to help you. The guy you provoked today has a close relationship with the polar bear. If you want to live, don't talk nonsense. Hurry up and leave with us." After saying that, the person immediately closed his mouth and nose again. Numun looked at the two people's clothes and nodded imperceptibly. Then he followed the two guys in hooded robes and walked to the stairs in the corner of Devil's Stomach. "Go to the second floor, then we will leave from the roof." One of the two was very tall. He was the one who stopped Numun's action just now. The one who spoke now was his companion. This person was very thin and weak. "Don't worry, I've already planned it." They stepped on the oak stairs and went to the second floor of the tavern. This was a shelter for the merchants who temporarily lived in Harbor City. The thin hooded man took out a key and opened the wooden door of a guest room. The three of them quickly rushed in, opened the window, and climbed up to the roof of the tavern. During this process, Naaman discovered a secret. The man who looked like a stick of reed had no legs. Instead, there were two steel-like objects. The curved steel plates seemed to be connected to his thighs. However, this did not mean that the man's movements were inconvenient. On the contrary, because he had lost a lot of weight, he was much more agile and vigorous than ordinary people. Stepping on the edge of the window, the man leaped onto the roof with the help of the steel sheet. Naaman and another tall man had to grab onto the edge of the eaves with both hands and use the strength of their arms to climb up. There was a coiled hemp rope on the roof. It seemed to have been soaked in tung oil, making it look slippery. The skinny man bent down and grabbed one end of the rope. "After I jump over and tie the rope, you can grab the rope and row over." As he spoke, he ran up and leaped across the street behind the Devil's Stomach Tavern without any tools. It was worth mentioning that even though it was an unremarkable street in King's Landing City, it was still 6 or 7 yards wide. The man's run-up was only 2 or 3 steps, yet he could leap so far. His jumping ability was truly frightening. Naaman felt that it was probably the mechanical device on the man's feet that worked. Otherwise, a normal human would not be able to do this. After tying the rope, Naaman and the tall man, one in front and one behind, used the handle of a great axe and a towel to hang on the oil-soaked rope. The last one to land was a tall and strong man. He took out a flint lighter from his pocket and ignited the rope. "Clean up the mess. Although it's better than nothing, it's still better than doing nothing." As he spoke, he smiled at Naaman and then pointed at a polar bearman security team that turned the corner of the street. The man named Kurian was beside the captain of the security team. As he ran with them, he pointed in the direction of the Devil's Stomach. "Buddy, we are now on the same boat," the tall man said to Naaman. "Perhaps you still have some doubts, but now is not the time to question. If you don't want to be taken away by the polar bear men, we have to get on the boat first." Naaman made a wise choice. Thus, after weaving through the various alleys of King's Landing City's port trade area, they sprinted for about 10 minutes before arriving at the port's anchorage. At an inconspicuous berth, they boarded a triangular sailboat. This was a fishing boat. When it sailed out of the port, The port staff thought that the three were fishermen who wanted to go fishing at night. However, they did not sail on the designated route. Instead, they disappeared into the gradually darkening curtain of the night. The sparkling waves of the sea reflected the bright lights of the port in the distance. The boat sailed out of War God's Summit, originally known as the protruding promontory where the emperor died. Now, there was only a storm mech crouching on top of it, overlooking King's Landing City, casting a huge shadow. After about 2 hourglasses of sailing, they arrived at a beach on the west side of King's Landing City's coastline. The surface of the sea was gloomy. The waves slammed into the pebbles of the beach, smashing them into pieces and retreating with a long hiss. The three of them worked together to pull the boat up to the shore and stopped at the beach. Not far ahead, there was a sandbank that could block the wind. Thus, a campfire flickered behind them. "Our brothers are over there," the tall man said to Namen. "They must have prepared good wine and sumptuous food." When Namen climbed over the sandbank, he saw a burning bonfire. A large piece of beef was being roasted on top of it. Fresh fish and pork ribs were hanging on a three-legged grill, and a meat spit around the bonfire. The overflowing grease dripped onto the coals, crackling and popping. Next to the bonfire was a person holding a cup, occasionally pouring beer on the burnt areas. Hearing the commotion behind him, the person in charge of roasting meat immediately drew the sword at his waist. However, in terms of its size, the sword was a little too slender, more like a spare barbecue spit than a lethal weapon. "Brothers, you're back." The person saw that the newcomers had taken off their hoods and immediately let down his guard. He smiled and greeted them. Even though there was a tall stranger beside them, he did not ask a single question. "Yes, brother. We're already hungry." The tall man walked down the sandbank, picked up a can of beer, and gulped it down. He also threw another can at Namen. After Namen caught it, he opened the lid and took a sip. The beer had a muddy smell. He felt around in a deerskin pouch at his waist and took out a few gem coins that could not be used in King's Landing City. "Consider this my fare and beer money." Chapter 783. One old-fashioned character. The tall man wiped the beer foam from his lips when he saw Namen handing over the gemstone coin. He seemed to be praising and mocking at the same time. His guttural sounds were very short, like a taut rope. However, the skinny man looked at Namen suspiciously. "How do you know we accept gemstone coins?" He paused and organized his words before continuing. "This is King's Landing City. No one will pay with gemstone coins. We all use King's Landing banknotes." Namen shrugged his shoulders. He unhooked the single-edged axe from the hook at his waist. This action made the others nervous. The guy who was roasting beef here took out a boning knife. He leaned on the handle of the axe and stood at an angle. "Continue pretending?" Namen looked at the skinny man. "When we were in the tavern and running around the city, you didn't smell anything special. But after floating on the sea for 2 hourglasses, when the sea breeze blows, you can't hide the smell of oil on your body. It's a special kind of oil from Dwarf Island. It's usually used to lubricate the mechanical creations of the dwarves. So why don't you open my eyes?" The tall man glanced at his companion. He had already warned him not to underestimate the people who made a living in King's Landing City. Goods from all over the world were gathered here. Even the most ordinary city dweller had a much higher standard than the people of Ramsey. The skinny man's face was expressionless. He nodded. "Good insight." Just as he finished speaking, a series of cracking sounds suddenly came from his neck. Then a horrifying scene occurred. The man's head was separated from his neck. The round head fell and smashed into the soft sand. "That makes sense," muttered Namen, sounding as though he were trying to hide his astonishment. Such a tone made the other people present laugh, but they also thought that it was normal for people to behave this way. When they saw the skinny man remove his disguise, they had a similar thought. At this time, the skinny man was scattered into parts on the ground. From the pile of robes on the ground, a dwarf with a big head popped out. "I am a Brastat," the dwarf said solemnly. "Son of Daraport, grandson of Orpheus, special investigator of Dwarf Island's External Investigation Bureau, member of STEM's Devout Society." After saying these words, he glanced at the tall man, standing behind him. The man rubbed his bald head and revealed his true identity to Naman. I am a lightning monk blessed by His Majesty's stem. I belong to the second sequence. This is the first time we meet. Please take care of me. I hope we can cooperate in the future. Naman didn't comment. In fact, as the person in charge of the diplomatic affairs of the Scale of Perpetual Order, he was an elite spy. This contract demon, who had already completely transformed into a Leviathan, actually knew more things. For example, the Lightning Monk used to work in Soft Maple City, a city that had disappeared more than 10 years ago. At that time, he served the mayor of Stem City and led his own mercenary group to provide security. Later on, the mayor was deceived by the demonic Fish Council and was corrupted into a depraved fishman. The mercenary group leader disappeared without a trace after that. After the battle of the fall of the Emperor, a new religion began to appear in the human kingdom of Ramsey. This religion believed in a dwarf god called the God of Virtual Games. The priests he developed in human society were called lightning monks. When the mercenary group leader reappeared in Ramsey's human society, he turned into a lightning monk. 5 years ago, the lightning monks were active in the cities of Ramsey. They wanted to spread the god's faith. However, in order to let ordinary people understand the teachings of STEM, they had to build a temple called the Game Hut. At that time, the infrastructure of the cities of Ramsey couldn't be compared to that of Dwarf Island. Therefore, their plan to spread the faith was stuck in a quagmire. Their only solution was to enter the territory of the Scale of Perpetual Order to spread the faith. Throughout the Ramsey Plain, only a large trading city like King's Landing could mobilize enough resources to build a game hut. However, the Lightning Monks couldn't enter this trading city. Although the Scale of Perpetual Order didn't explicitly prohibit the Lightning Monks from spreading the faith, it imposed a heavy tax on the game hut that had to be run. As the god of virtual games, his clergy restricted his actions. He had to promote games for profit. What was even more outrageous was that in addition to the business tax, the city's security also had to collect various security management fees from these game huts. Moreover, even if the Lightning Monks wanted to run at a loss, these game huts had to abide by various management regulations such as minors are not allowed to enter, individual entertainment time is not allowed to exceed 1 hourglass, games provided by the venue must be reviewed, and so on. In other words, even if they opened a game hut, they wouldn't be able to spread the faith quickly. This was because the management of King's Landing City didn't propose a ban on virtual games, nor did they oppose the god of virtual games in name. In addition, the power of the Scale of Perpetual Order was obvious to all. Therefore, the backing of the Lightning Monks, the STEM Shrine of Dwarf Island, couldn't use force against them. The most they could do in recent years was to send negotiators to protest. However, if protest was effective, why would the multiverse need violence? After hitting the wall so many times, even if one was stubborn, one would still be enlightened. As a matter of fact, the spies of the Scale of Perpetual Order buried in Dwarf Island had recently sent back a message. Dwarf Island had secretly sent a small team to King's Landing City. However, they weren't there to negotiate or assassinate anyone. Instead, they were there for some other unknown operation. Thus, Naman, who had perfectly inherited the talent of contract magic, quickly sorted out dozens of possible schemes that the dwarves might want to carry out. After assessing the risks, he decided to take the initiative to attack and infiltrate the enemy's ranks to steal more information. That was why there was such a farce at the Demon's Stomach Tavern today. And the actor who cooperated with Naman, Kurian, was the Were-Beast Bitterface who was first discovered by Keys in the Ash World's Taka City arena. Later, because of his likable appearance, he was brought as a mascot to the Polar Bear Tribe Alliance in the island world. Of course, this was only the first script of the various fishing scripts. But what Naman didn't expect was that their first acting actually piqued the interest of those fellows. He couldn't help but guess that those fellows were so careless now because they had encountered some difficulties during the implementation of their plan and were eager to find a solution. Chapter 784. I don't have any other choice. After hearing the two people in front of him reveal their identities, Naman pretended to be helpless. This was the normal behavior of an experienced adventurer. Logically speaking, if someone who had deliberately concealed their identity suddenly revealed the truth to you, they would either want to kill you to silence you or pull you into their group. A wise answer. The lightning monk, come mercenary leader, smiled and retracted the part of the chain hammer that was exposed from his sleeve. His partner, who was responsible for roasting beef, put his finger to his mouth and whistled. With a clear whistle, several mercenaries holding crossbows vaguely appeared on top of the sand embankment. They used soft cushions covered with glue to cover themselves in the sand and hid in the sand pit that they dug in advance. Naaman inserted his axe into the sand and walked to the campfire. He tore off a large piece of beef leg and put it in his mouth, then picked up a skewer of roasted pork chops and began to eat with the beer he just received. I can see. Ablandstat sat beside him and gnawed on a skewer of roasted quail. The dwarf said to Naaman without looking up, "You're a person with a story. Why don't you share your story so that we can decide what to do next?" Naaman took a big gulp of sour beer and wiped the foam on his lips. "Do you really want to hear it?" After receiving an affirmative response, he began to talk. The story starts 11 years ago, which is now called the Year of the Monster. Next, he used an ordinary narrative to tell a story that couldn't be considered completely fictional. A Jorm's pirate group that was originally wandering in the northern waters encountered the legendary Leviathan of the scale of perpetual order before the Emperor was awakened. A surviving pirate's son rowed a life raft back to the shore. After a difficult journey of survival, he began an even more difficult journey to make a living. Because he only had two skills, sailing and wielding an axe, there were very few job opportunities for him to choose from. In addition, after the monster army ravaged Ramsey, almost no merchant ships along the coast dared to continue trading. Without merchant ships, the pirates naturally disappeared without a trace. In the end, he could only join a group of wealthy merchants who fled to the south, relying on his ability to wield axes in exchange for a meager salary from his employer. Later, he wandered between the cities of the south and the west. Half of his time was spent as a guard for caravans, and the other half was spent tending horses for the great ranchers in the west of Ramsey. Today is the third time I've come to King's Landing City. At the end of his speech, he looked at the lightning monk who had finished his roast beef and was closing his eyes to meditate. "I've just bought a ranch, and I want to purchase a batch of six-legged colts bred by the desert elves." It seems that Brother Naaman is still a little reserved. The bald lightning monk, come mercenary captain, suddenly opened his eyes and interrupted Naaman's description of the purpose of this trip. "Let me finish for you, you bold grave robber." It turned out that he was not meditating with his eyes closed, but was using the lightning monk's ability to communicate with other companions. Every time Naaman said a word, he would pass it on to some of his lightning monk companions in the south and west of the Ramsey continent, so that they could verify the information. Almost at the same time, when Naaman finished his story, the mercenary captain had already found out all his details. This story was both true and false. According to the information his companions had sent back, Naaman was indeed the son of a pirate captain of Jomu. He did indeed come to the land to make a living during the year of the monster invasion, and he did indeed buy a new ranch. However, in the process of making a living, his occupation was definitely not a caravan guard or a professional horse wrangler. It was quite ironic that his occupation happened to be the opposite of those two occupations, a merchant route robber and a horse thief. However, in recent years, the scale of perpetual order had expanded too quickly, and it had announced that the main road from King's Landing was under the protection of the Chamber of Commerce. Any bandits who dared to rob near there would be severely punished. Therefore, Naaman changed his occupation. From robbing the living to robbing the dead, he became a notorious grave robber. The reason he had come to King's Landing now was because he had been hired by some power. The reason why the lightning monk called him daring was because that power was suspected to be the remnants of the monster invasion. They had hired Naaman to come to King's Landing for the purpose of excavating the legendary soul-subduing tomb. The so-called soul-subduing tomb was actually a seal that stored the remains of Shurgu, Panther Man, Foolish Man, Soul Seeker, and Dog Tamer after they had been killed. It was said that these tombs were located in King's Landing and were heavily guarded. When the lightning monk heard this news, he was shocked to the extreme. As a human who had fought against the monster invasion, He found it hard to imagine that someone would steal the bones of the monster invasion with the purpose of resurrecting them. He had wanted to deal with this scourge himself, but when he sent a message to Ablenstadt, the dwarf investigator stopped him. The dwarf's reply was, "This grave robber's actions may be helpful to our plan." The lightning monk fell into deep thought for a while. Although he didn't want to admit it, his rationality told him that the dwarf investigator's answer was indeed feasible. The purpose of their trip was to steal the banknote printing technology of King's Landing. Only by obtaining this technology could they control the development of King's Landing, just like how the dwarves used gem coins to control the city-states of Ramsey. There was no doubt that the difficulty of this task was very high. The biggest difficulty was not only obtaining the technology, but also how to transport the equipment to realize the technology. Compared to the current stable situation in King's Landing, their plan would be easier to succeed in the turbulent King's Landing. We also want a share of the loot. Looking at Numan, whose expression changed abruptly after he laid his cards on the table, and whose fingers were already gripping the handle of the single-edged great axe beside him, Ablenstadt calmly said, "Of course, we will also provide cover for your tomb robbing and some help. What can you help me with?" Your accomplices are now lurking in King's Landing." The lightning monk had no intention of bargaining with him. But those people probably haven't determined the exact location of the soul-subduing tomb. Otherwise, you would have already done it. If we can find this matter, there is no reason why the scale of perpetual order can't find it. The longer you delay, the higher the risk of your plan being exposed. Chapter 785. Ablenstadt convinced Naaman, and they decided to put aside their previous differences and work together intimately. As a restraint, they took out a magic contract. "Both of us will benefit from this," the gnome investigator said to Naaman, but he did not know that it was impossible for a mortal to benefit from signing a contract with a contract demon. Naturally, Naaman only hesitated for a moment before he signed his name on the contract. For a contract demon, as long as the handwriting was slightly changed, there would still be a huge loophole in the contract, even if it was his real name that was signed on the contract. It could be signed successfully, but it could not be executed normally. With this false foothold, even if the contract's terms were considered strict, Naaman could still easily find some profitable loopholes in it. Moreover, he quickly obtained his first surprise. Due to the lack of relevant information, he could only be described as mercenary captain, tall man, lightning monk, etc., but he signed his real name on the contract. Oaken Fist, meaning oak fist. From a name, this man should be from the eastern city-state of Ramsey. It matched the background of most of the mercenary group he led. The completed magic contract stipulated that Oak Fist had to find the exact location of the Tomb of Requiem within 3 days, and if Naaman successfully walked out of the tomb, Oaken and Ablenstadt had to escort him out of the city. These two requirements did not require them to enter the tomb that was full of danger, so it seemed relatively safe. However, in reality, it was not that simple. Otherwise, Naaman would not have agreed to accept their help and at the same time give them half of the mission commission. If Oak Fist and the gnome could really do what they promised, then this cooperation would be worth more than the price. After dinner and signing the contract, the gnome and the lightning monk invited Naaman to stay in the tent they had prepared. Not only was there a mercenary group lying in ambush under the sand dike, but there was also a temporary stronghold dugout. These people used the rectangular pressure-resistant inflatable tents produced by Dwarf Island to build a warm and secluded shelter for themselves. "I know King's Landing better than the best street traveler you can find." Before resting, this was the last thing Naaman heard from Oak Fist. "I hope so," Naaman replied simply. For the next few days, they stayed near the sand dike and camped. Occasionally, a few mercenaries would disguise themselves and walk on the official road a few miles away, following the main road to King's Landing City to buy some food. In the end, Naaman's patience was running out. He kept telling the gnome and the lightning monk that his companions, who had been out of contact for a long time, could become dangerous variables. Oak Fist comforted him. "A good meal is not afraid of late, just wait." 7 days later, Oak Fist finally announced a piece of good news to Naaman when the fake bruises on his body from the tavern fight had completely disappeared. I found the exact location of the Requiem tomb. We can start the operation today. However, the lightning monk immediately asked Naaman to forgive him. I need your cooperation to sneak into that place. Interesting, Naaman thought. There are many things that can only be done in a cell. The guards looked at each other and laughed, then slammed the cell door shut. Naaman stood up, patted the dust off his body, and stretched his shoulders. Because Oak Fist had punched him, there was still some soreness there. The human body is so fragile. The Leviathan contract fiend complained to his heart, but he quickly adjusted his attitude. He began to observe the scene in the cell. The bottom half of the cell door was a solid wooden door, while the top half was an iron bar. He could see 3 guards opening his large luggage bag and checking, or rather, ransacking his belongings. One of them noticed his line of sight. It was a short but fierce-looking fellow. He had a shaved head, and the tattoo on his neck revealed his identity. A jailer from the Japanese river, Naaman thought to himself. The light in the cell was very dim, and the dirty uniforms of the few people could barely be seen as the signature yellow and blue of King's Landing City's prison management. The short prison guard walked slowly to the door of the cell, leaving his companions to continue to play with Naaman's belongings. I heard that you're good at fighting, the man said, while looking Naaman up and down. Naaman did not answer. The bartender of the Prancing Horse Tavern said that you've knocked down almost 20 people. The prison guard rubbed his chin. I don't think you're that great. Anyway, you should think clearly before you come back and continue to make trouble. Others will only spend a few nights in the cell or get a few lashes. But you dare to make trouble in the devil's stomach and attempt to murder Mr. Corian. Idiot, you should go to the gallows. Naaman turned around. The cell was quite practical, but it lacked creativity. There was a slender light at the top of one wall. The damp stone wall was covered with moss, and there was a pile of rotten and dirty straw in the corner. This used to be a labor camp dormitory, and then it was converted into a prison in King's Landing City. Originally, the guards here were desert elf warriors and camel warriors. Now, they were jailers who were transferred from Jiangjin. They specialized in different fields. Hey, look, said a prison guard who was rummaging through a luggage bag. What's this? The people who guarded the dungeon were often as bad as the people they guarded, or even worse. Naaman did not think much of this phenomenon. After all, the scale of perpetual order did not care whether these people were in or out of the prison. It was enough to make the best use of them and keep them away from the hardworking, decent people. In fact, with the power of the Chamber of Commerce, it was entirely possible to find some underworld demons to guard the dungeon. But that was just a waste of resources, especially in this situation. A prison guard took a slender object wrapped in white linen from Naaman's luggage bag. The man opened the package and whistled. It was a long sword with a thin blade and a silver scabbard. The hilt was made of black jade. Who do you think he stole it from? The short prison guard glanced at Naaman, as if wondering if he was a noble from another city. King's Landing did not have a noble system, but there were many nobles and ladies in the neighboring cities. But which noble would wear such a pale brown cloak? Which noble would condescend to participate in a bar fight, and more than once? Not to mention, the stubble on Naaman's face reeked of sour beer, not the taste of high-end wine. On his feet was a pair of rubber-soled canvas boots that only adventurers would wear. Let me see, said the short man, walking over to his companion. He was obviously the leader of the Japanese prison guards, for one of them handed him the luxurious longsword. He grumbled as he took the sword. Apparently, he was frightened by its weight. He turned the sword over and noticed the clasp that fastened the scabbard to the hilt to prevent accidental unsheathing. He unfastened it. Be careful. That sword is dangerous, Naaman whispered with a smile. The head prison guard looked up at him, and the surroundings quieted down. The man snorted and made a subtle gesture. The prison guards threw some worthless trinkets, the single-edged axe, some jewel coins that could only be used in other cities, and a few pieces of paper with scribbles on them into the luggage bag. The bag was thrown into a corner of the dungeon. The luxurious longsword and some King's Landing banknotes were held in a place where everyone could see them. Several prison guards walked to a prison guard's lounge and then closed the door with a bang. Naaman shrugged and waited for the show to begin. Chapter 786. Naaman quickly knelt down in the corner and picked up a long and sturdy straw. He pulled a few threads from the bottom of his tattered cloak and tied the straw into the shape of a 3-inch tall man. Then he plucked out an eyebrow and stuck it to the straw man's head with his saliva. Then he reached into his boot and pulled out a bright red turban. Then he bit a soft sack hidden under his tongue. A shiny and transparent gas flowed out of his mouth, like the color of oil on water under the sun. Naaman could feel the magic power contained in it. The little straw man twitched and absorbed the magic power. In Naaman's hand, half of the bright red turban turned gray. He bent down and, at the same time, recalled the message engraved with magic on the turban, completed the last step of the awakening, giving the order. "Get the key," he said. The straw man stood up and raised its only eyebrow at Naaman. Naaman pointed to the jailer's lounge. Cries of surprise came from there. Those fellows don't have much time, he thought. The little spell puppet soon came back. It climbed up the cell door's window, carrying a bunch of keys on its back. The straw man's feet were stained with red. In the cell that lacked light, the bright red seemed especially dim. He took the keys. "Thank you," he said. This was one of Naaman's few habits. It seemed meaningless, but it was the mantra of the contract devils for thousands of years. He touched the straw man's chest. The little spell puppet was immediately dispelled and fell on its back. Its life force was quickly draining away, and the cries in the jailer's lounge gradually died down. Naaman put his hand out of the bars and opened the cell door with the key. He pushed open the thick door, rushed into the corridor, and picked up the duffel bag that the jailers had abandoned in the corner. However, he did not go to the jailer's lounge, which was the only way out of the dungeon, but deeper into the dungeon. This was the information provided by the paper in the duffel bag. The markings on the paper were not scribbles at all, but a language commonly used by the pirates of Jomis. Very few people in the city-states of the Ramsey continent knew how to use this language, let alone the Japanese jailers who were not residents of this plane. However, as a contract devil, he was born with the ability to understand all kinds of languages. This little test that the dwarf and the lightning monk had set up for him seemed to have been tailor-made for him. It was easily resolved by Naaman. He really knows King's Landing City well. Looking at the letters, Naaman thought to himself, he has worked in Soft Maple City for many years. That Oak Fist probably knows everything about this area. It turned out that the few pieces of paper described a plan in the language of the pirates of Joms. Ablenstadt and Oak Fist first apologized for knocking Naaman unconscious, then explained why they wanted to send him to the dungeon of King's Landing. For safety reasons, the underground soul-subduing tomb will definitely be built in an area close to the rock formation. Otherwise, with the water content of the soil in this coastal area, the underground structure will be flooded in less than a year or two. There's only one place to choose, and that is where the tallest building in Soft Maple City, the White Paper Tower, is now the prison of King's Landing City. Below the death row cell, there's a prison cell specially used for interrogating prisoners. After entering, the spell engraved on the red scarf will provide you with all the tools you need to rob the tomb. If you can come out of the dungeon alive, you can meet up with your accomplices. We have already screened them. You are very lucky. Even after losing contact for 7 days, they still did not betray you. That was natural. After Naaman finished reading the letter, he felt a little amused. How could those so-called accomplices betray the devil who had signed the contract of hell with them? Even if they had superhuman courage, their strength did not allow them to do so. When he finished reading the letters, he seemed to have triggered some kind of hidden magic, and the pieces of paper suddenly burned to ashes. Naaman climbed the stairs and walked to the interrogation cell at the bottom of the dungeon. He was actually not a stranger to this place. In the few years when King's Landing City was established, other than the half-lich Snade, he came here the most times to personally preside over the work. However, there were many miscellaneous matters in recent years, and there were not as many daring idiots as there were in the first few years, so he had not been here for a long time. Ignoring the tool racks with all kinds of torture instruments, many of which had given the contract demon temporary pleasure. He walked straight to the deepest part of the interrogation cell. He stopped in front of a large stone wall that seemed to have been sucked dry of color. He took out the red headscarf. In order to ensure that the plan could be carried out step by step, when the lightning monk engraved the priest's spells, he had deliberately divided them into two groups. The first group of activation spell was very simple. Narman just had to take the red scarf out of his boots. In order to activate the second group of spells, he needed to read out a secret code. It was written on the letters in the pirate language of Jorms. "Thou art what I need." Using the pure Jorms code to call out this sentence, the remaining color on the red scarf quickly faded, and it completely turned into a gray linen rag. Narman felt that the weight in his hands had become much heavier. Hiding spell. He nodded and threw the rag aside. Then he gently placed the wrought-tan suitcase in his hands on the ground. This was a prop that Narman had carefully prepared to play the role of a tomb raider. It was originally entrusted to a core gang for safekeeping. It was obvious that the lightning monk and the dwarf had gone to find that person and successfully retrieve the toolbox. The reason why Narman put it down gently was because he was very clear about what was in the wrought-tan suitcase. There were a few bottles of alchemy solution that could not withstand any collision. A slight impact could cause them to explode, and everything around them would be blown away before being burned to ashes. Alchemical fire oil, glands of the Sol rock monster, dried bat dung powder, a few iron thorn vine seeds. He poured a few materials into a stone bowl and carefully took out a glass mixing stick to mix them evenly. Finally, Narman used a solution called self-boiling alchemy solvent and steeped it into a bowl of bubbling dark blue liquid. He took out a small brush made of beech and boar's mane from the wrought-tan suitcase, dipped it in the bowl of liquid, and smeared it on the dark gray wall bit by bit. In order to let the solution fully penetrate the wall, Narman repeatedly brushed it several times. The entire bowl of alchemy solution was smeared on an area that could allow a person to pass through sideways. On the dark gray wall, a crack was smeared out by the dark blue solution. He took out a few glass, spherical bottles from the wrought-tan suitcase and put them into the deerskin luggage bag. Then he held his single-edged axe in his hand. Pop, pop, pop. He gently knocked the edge of the axe handle on the crack. Every time, there would be a faint spark, and the fine iron thorn vines that grew in the wall would burn to ashes. In the end, after smashing it a dozen times, the crack turned into pieces of gravel that fell to the ground with a crashing sound. Chapter 787. Keyes had set a rule for the management of the scale of perpetual order. Therefore, in this land named after King's Landing, there were not only harsh punishments, but also medical treatment, urban infrastructure, and other social benefits that were hard to find anywhere else in Ramsey. Even in the large merchant guilds of the old Ramsey era that were extremely hostile to King's Landing due to their interests being infringed upon, there were many who admitted that ordinary people would live more comfortably there because their master would loosen their shackles from time to time. This guiding principle ran through all aspects of King's Landing, and the diplomatic field led by Narman was naturally no exception. However, the cunning contract demon would never be at a disadvantage. If he loosened the shackles on himself, then he would have to tighten the shackles on others as well. It's been almost 12 years. Narman couldn't help but sigh as he walked into the secret room in the depths of the dungeon. Of course, he wasn't lamenting about how long it had been. In fact, for him who had the blood of an evil demon from the lower realm, such a small amount of time was nothing at all. Many Ramsey people have begun to mix with the dwarves again, and this is not in line with the master's intentions. It's time to give you a history lesson. If you want to enjoy a good life, you have to know who your true friends are. Through a coffin made completely of hardened glass, Narman saw the corpse of a general that had been buried here before, or rather, a piece of flesh that could barely be seen. The ogre Neru's violent beating had caused it to be unable to recover its original form for more than 10 years. Narman took out a heavy lead bottle from his wrought-tan suitcase and shook it forcefully. Then he opened the cork and poured the acid inside onto the hardened glass coffin in front of him. Then he took out a small pickaxe-like tool and slowly dug out the hardened glass that had softened due to the corrosion. In the end, he dug out a hole the size of an ordinary person's waist. The stench from the coffin spread out, but this demon spy was indifferent to it. He still methodically took out another bottle of potion. This wasn't an alchemy product of Ramsey, but a high-grade tonic jointly created by the three masters who helped the scale of Perpetual Order expand its business in Sigil City: Pooh, the goat, Paru the ogre, and Snade the half-lich. He poured the bottle of tonic into the hole and poured it all over the flesh and blood of the general. Not a single drop was wasted. It's a necessary investment. After doing this, Naman could not help but feel a little pained. In order to buy this bottle of flesh essence potion that was said to be able to bring the dead back to life, he had to use half of his department's annual budget. That was a huge sum of 5,000 soul prisms, or at least twice the amount of platinum coins. If this money was given to a suitable broker, he would definitely be able to hire a few pit fiends, or perhaps even get a blazing Templar to join in a battle that did not go against his morals. Therefore, using it to revive a Calamity General was definitely a huge loss in terms of combat strength. Fortunately, Naman had other calculations that calmed him down slightly. In terms of influence, this investment is worth it. As the old saying goes, you get what you pay for. When the flesh essence potion was poured on the remains of the Calamity General, it quickly produced an effect. The lump of flesh formed from broken bones and rotten flesh began to wriggle, and after the time it took to take a few breaths, it changed into a different shape. For limbs, a torso, and a head were regenerated, and a layer of colorful skin gradually covered the outside. After a third of an hourglass, a naked Calamity General appeared in the hardened glass coffin. He had yet to regain consciousness, and his body was slightly weak due to the lack of nourishment. However, in the eyes of an evil demon like Naman, the Calamity General's body began to emit a different color from the previous lump of flesh and seemed to be full of vitality. The Panther Man had been revived. His skin was a pure brown with colorful black stripes on it. There were some bruises on his craggy body that had not completely healed, and around the wounds there was a brilliant blue and purple luster. Naman did not let his guard down. He knew that this Calamity General was famous for his speed, and at the same time, the fur on the surface of his body had a good resistance to many spells. Therefore, before he regained consciousness, Naman directly cast a powerful, weakening spell on him. The Calamity General tried hard to open his eyes, but he closed them again. Naman reached out and grabbed the fellow by the back of his neck and dragged him out of the hardened glass coffin like a kitten. Then he took out a pair of shackles, a pair of handcuffs, and a steel gag used to stuff his sharp teeth in a rattan suitcase. These torture instruments were engraved with magic runes, and as long as Naman chanted an activation cipher, their quality would instantly increase by dozens of times. Wearing the torture instruments, the speed that the Leopard Man was so proud of would no longer be a threat. He had to ensure that this Calamity General would not cause too much chaos in the current King's Landing city. If he needed to have fun, then it would be better to get to the dwarf's territory first. Because most areas of the dungeon had anti-teleportation arrays, Naman could not directly open a teleportation door here to escape. He could only drag the tied Calamity General, step by step, to the upper floor of the dungeon, to the floor where he was imprisoned. In order to quickly suppress the possible riots, the jailer's lounge was not blocked by magic, and it was the only place in the entire prison where the teleportation spell could be used. The shackles dragged on the ground, and as they moved, they kept making clack-clack sounds. When they reached the door of the jailer's lounge, Naman did not go around the pool of blood flowing along the stone floor. He dragged the Leopard Man and directly passed through it. He used the key he had obtained before to open the oak door and saw 3 dead Japanese jailers lying on the ground. "You are indeed more agile than I thought," Oak Fist's voice came. Lightning Monk had been invisible just now. When he saw the Calamity General in Naman's hand, his eyelids could not help but blink, but he quickly controlled his emotions. The long sword with its silver scabbard was now firmly held in his hand. Naman's guess was wrong. The spell cast on the luxurious longsword was not animate weapon, but translocation. When the jailers tried to pull out the longsword, they triggered the spell and brought about the bringer of death. Still, It saved him the trouble of opening a teleportation door. If the lightning monk could come here, he could probably leave with Naman. Looks like I don't have to look for my accomplice anymore. Naman pretended to be cautious. He threw the leopard man to the ground and took out his single-edged great axe from his duffel bag. Oak Fist did not offer any explanation, or perhaps the lightning monk was too lazy to explain. Time is fleeting. As he spoke, the cleric of the god of virtual games reached out with his index finger and lightly touched the air, and a teleportation door glowing with energy ripples appeared out of thin air in front of Naman. Smart people have to learn how to grasp it. Dragging the Calamity General, Naman followed the lightning monk into the teleportation door. As the familiar spatial energy surged towards him, Naman was so comfortable that he took a deep breath of non-existent air. As the air near the exit of the teleportation door crackled, as the energy stirred the air, the Covenant demon withdrew his playful smile as he stepped out of the door. You might not have heard of this saying. Smart people are always fooled by their own cleverness. Chapter 788. Scarman. Oh no, Warden Fezzik. A Japanese warden looked at the orc in front of him and swallowed involuntarily. He acted very stupidly just now. He actually called out the nickname that his colleagues gave the warden behind his back. But fortunately, Fezzik did not seem to care about it. How many people died? 3 people. All of them were wardens hired from Zhejiangjin. They're very good at punishing and managing slaves. So, someone slit their throats one by one like slaughtering chickens. Fezzik glanced at him coldly. They couldn't even make a sound. The warden wanted to say, weren't their throats slit? How could they make a sound? But he wisely shut his mouth and did not defend the dead people. Fezzik took a deep breath of the bloody air in the warden's lounge. His nose wrinkled, and the fangs protruding from his lips twitched. Send these people to the mortuary. You do it yourself. After he finished speaking, he turned around and walked out of the dungeon, ignoring the prison warden who had a look of horror on his face. When he returned to the ground, Fezzik scratched the scar on his neck. Scarman, quite a good nickname. It's much more practical than Broken Bear's Head. He entertained himself with his daydream for a while until the scheduled time. Only then did he ride his dire wolf companion and gallop out of the prison's gate. He pretended to be in a hurry and rushed all the way to the security administration of King's Landing City. In addition to being the warden of King's Landing Prison, this orc also served as the captain of the security administration's second action team. In fact, compared to the former, he actually preferred the latter, which allowed him to exercise from time to time. Sir, Fezzik walked into the office at the top of the security administration and respectfully greeted the desert elf who was busy with the desk. The bait has been thrown out. Should we send some people to follow it so that we can do a better job when we reel in the net? Don't follow. Brock stood up. This desert elf was taller and stronger than the orc. He rubbed the speech spell amplifier that covered his mouth and nose and said in a deep voice, "We're going to organize a city-wide manhunt." But Fezzik wanted to question it. But perhaps he thought of something, or perhaps it was purely out of respect for the man in front of him. He immediately changed his words. Should I inform the 1st and 3rd operations teams? After all, the Monarch's Descent City is quite big. Brock nodded. He did not care about the orc who left in a hurry to deliver his orders. Instead, he looked at the information board hanging on the wall. All the regions of King's Landing City were drawn on pieces of papyrus and glued to the surface by piecing them together. In some places, because there were diagrams of underground or internal spaces, several floors were reserved. If Fezzik had just seen this map, he would have discovered that his route from the prison to the Security Administration Bureau had already been marked out. That orange line ran through 13 streets. Other than a few industrial areas in the inner continent of Monarch's Landing City, it basically radiated to all the important places in the port. They must have received the news, Brock thought to himself. Previously, when making this plan, he and Naman had considered all kinds of possible accidents. Now, Naman did not go to the predetermined place to meet with his accomplices, nor did he use any magic to communicate with them. So, it could only be the dwarf investigator and the electric monk who took them away. Yes, it was them, including the leopard man. This was one of the unexpected situations. The dwarf investigator and the electric monk's appetite was much bigger than expected. They actually wanted to get their hands on the newly resurrected Calamity General. This also meant that the conspiracy of this group of people might be bigger than the desert elves expected. If they want to do something big, they must be more careful than usual, Brock thought. He had already made up his mind to gather people to put on a big show for those guys. They must be very alert to make them feel confident that they have really obtained a priceless treasure. Then, they will continue to give themselves away in front of Naaman. Looking at the map on the information board in front of him, Brock put himself in the role of the opponent to think about the next plan to be implemented. At the same time, he was also weighing every step of the plan. He could not let the opponent destroy the industrial zone, which was an important production base of the scale of perpetual order in the world of Ramsey. He could not let them destroy the port trade area too much, which was an important place for the import and export of the scale of perpetual order. He must deceive them to some targets that seemed to have destructive value but would not harm the core interests. It would be best to let those who had colluded with Dwarf Island and had business in King's Landing City pay for the evil deeds of their unreliable allies. Finally, before the captains of the 3 action teams gathered in his office, Brock thought of a suitable place. Even if Calamity General had a good fight there, the scale of perpetual order would not feel any heartache for the loss there. "It's you," the desert elf said softly. As he crooked his finger, the vibration caused by the voice accurately hit a stack of papyrus on the information board and peeled it off. The Chamber of Commerce. This was a local chamber of commerce with great power in the port trade area of King's Landing City. However, according to reliable sources, this Chamber of Commerce was originally the agent of Dwarf Island. It was not until the Kings started a full-scale war and a large number of aquatic monsters destroyed their bases on the overseas islands that the Chamber of Commerce fled to Shihai Town in the Ramsey continent. Because of the generous hospitality, the family behind the Chamber of Commerce changed their faith to Nord, the Lord of Sea Wind, that Shihai Town worshipped, and completely integrated into the town. However, since then, the Chamber of Commerce family gradually tore off their disguise and exposed their nature of pursuing interests. They easily controlled Shihai Town with their strong military force and the capital they brought with them when they fled. Within a few years, all the original residents of Shihai Town became employees of the Chamber of Commerce. They became guests and live a life dependent on the Chamber of Commerce. After the king was defeated, Shihai Town was one of the first areas to cooperate with the enclaves controlled by the scale of perpetual order. The Chamber of Commerce received rich returns and successfully entered the port area of King's Landing City 5 years ago. The Chamber of Commerce had a cooperative relationship with some Japanese merchants who had migrated to King's Landing City. They sailed together to hunt giant whales in the Ramsey Ocean and made profits from the whale bones, whale baleen, whale blubber, and other raw materials obtained from those giant beasts. This business practice made some immigrants from the island world, the walrus people and the polar bear people, very disgusted. They often protested against the practice of catching giant whales that exceeded the amount needed for food and only for raw materials. To be honest, this was not in line with the customs of the desert elves. Butchering whales and throwing away their flesh was extremely disrespectful to food in the eyes of the desert elves. Among the desert elves, those who dared to do this would usually starve to death, and the raw materials they obtained were mainly sold to Dwarf Island and the Japanese in the Ash World. The scale of Perpetual Order's collection and development system for black oil was already very developed. They did not need whale blubber as a raw material or fuel at all. As for fish bones and whale baleen products, because there were too many substitutes in Sigil City, they could not be sold at a high price. Therefore, Brock had long prepared to attack the Chamber of Commerce. After all, instead of letting them waste resources meaninglessly, it was better to divide and annex them to provide some help for the development of the scale of Perpetual Order. Now he finally had the opportunity to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. Chapter 789. In this private dock, people could smell all kinds of strange smells in the air. The smell of turpentine, fish, mustard, black lead, pomegranate oil, and the stench of urine in the morning mixed into a terrible rhapsody. Ordinary people would feel dizzy if they took a breath, except for those who lived here all year round. Too bad, grumbled the oaken fist in the tan robe softly, blowing his nose. They had been playing hide-and-seek with King's Landing security team for the entire night. From the large bazaar operated by the desert elves in the poor trade area, to the wooden fence of Camel King E, to the tavern street near the anchorage, when the sky was about to brighten, they passed through the small path in the port area ahead of the last night patrol and came to the commercial area known as the slaughterhouse dock. Yes, this was also a commercial area, but it was not an industry controlled by the scale of perpetual order. Therefore, like many of the industries operated by Ramsey's local chamber of commerce, the slaughterhouse dock was full of chaos and disorder. They could not rely on sufficient manpower, material resources to build a well-organized order like the scale of perpetual order. Fortunately, King's Landing was famous for being eclectic. The owners of Ramsey's local chamber of commerce were usually able to find suitable markets for their products in this city. However, their commercial areas were often only able to operate a single industry. They could not be like the large-scale commercial areas managed by the scale of perpetual order, which were involved in every field. And other than the employees of the local chamber of commerce, very few people were willing to sell their labor here. In this great city that was still expanding, people had more opportunities than other city-states in Ramsey. Becoming an employee of the industry under the scale of perpetual order was more in line with everyone's expectations. It seems that you don't know much about this place. Two mules stepped on the cobblestone road covered with thick plaster, and their hooves clattered against the ground. Hearing Oak Fist's soft complaint, Nauman, who was driving the wide-tailed carriage, chuckled and said, as if he was showing off, "What do you mean? I've been to King's Landing several times, and every time I try my best to explore the entire city and not just stay in a small, comfortable area." Naaman turned his head and glanced at Oaken Fist. They met at the Demon's Stomach, the oldest tavern in the Anchor Bar Street. It was rumored that the boss behind the tavern was one of the higher-ups of the scale of perpetual order. Then, Naaman continued, "There used to be a tavern here." He pointed to a blacksmith shop at the corner of the street. But it didn't work. Previously, this place was called the Slaughtering Wharf because there were many workshops for slaughtering whales and other harmful beasts. But now, those places have become processing plants for whale oil candles, whale bones, and whale baleen handicrafts. As he spoke, he even cupped his hands to his ears and pretended to listen. Did you hear that? It was the sound of a mallet being struck. There's a small barrel factory in this area that specializes in making wooden barrels used to hold whale blubber. The dwarf investigator, who had been silent, heard Nauman's explanation and couldn't help but interject. Is it because the scale of perpetual order felt that the slaughtering wharf was polluting the environment and damaging the city's appearance, so they ordered it to be renovated? He was half lying on the driver's seat of the wide-tailed carriage, and his body was still covered with the exoskeleton camouflage. However, this intricate product produced by Dwarf Island was not lubricated in time last night, so it didn't run smoothly today. Therefore, Ablenstadt could only make it half lie on the soft leather seat and rarely move around. Nauman knew the doubts hidden behind his words. One of the biggest customers of the slaughtering wharf, controlled by the Tradewind Chamber of Commerce, was Dwarf Island. Humans in Ramsey didn't use much whale products. Only alchemists needed a certain amount of whale blubber, and Dwarf Island needed whale blubber to make smokeless candles and lubricants. Whale baleen and whale bones were also highly sought after there. 100 years ago, the Tradewind Chamber of Commerce had a similar slaughtering wharf on Dwarf Island. Because the dwarves didn't want to do the dirty work that would stain their hands with blood and animal organs, they would hire some agents of the Ramsey Chamber of Commerce to do the work for them. However, as the scale of this business expanded, it affected the lives of the residents of Dwarf Island. Therefore, the Steam Assembly issued a demolition order in many chambers of commerce in the whaling industry, including the Tradewind Chamber of Commerce, moved out of Dwarf Island. They could only engage in slaughtering in their own bases on some small islands far away from Dwarf Island, and Dwarf Island would only purchase finished product from them on a regular basis. This trade lasted for many years. More than a decade ago, the Emperor suddenly returned, and the monster army wreaked havoc. All the chambers of commerce connected with Dwarf Island were attacked, and the trade was suspended for a while. Later, they fled to the Tradewind Chamber of Commerce in Ramsey to find jobs again. Originally, they were still slaughtering on the shore of King's Landing. However, because of the cooperation with the Wusan merchants, they learned the knowledge of long-distance sailing and more efficient production techniques. They also bought large sailing ships from the Wusan merchants. The fleet of the Tradewind Chamber of Commerce began to change to a highly efficient production model of fishing, slaughtering on board, and only bringing semi-processed raw materials back to the port. With these advantages, they successfully defeated several competitors and became the leader of the whale products industry in the Ramsey Plain. Therefore, after hearing the dwarf investigator's question, Narman just smiled and said nothing. He didn't need to teach the dwarf the logic of business competition. He just pretended to be stupid and said, "Maybe, but the Wusan merchants have shares in this slaughterhouse. Those Wusan merchants are the most obedient in front of the scales of eternal order. They never dare to cover up anyone who commits a crime in King's Landing, even if those people are actually cooperating with them. And because of this area is the darkness under the light of the Public Security Bureau. Can we get out of the city from here?" Oakfist glanced around and saw a few pairs of eyes in some of the buildings. They were looking at their minivan that was disguised as a whale product. He snapped his fingers and cast an illusion spell to isolate their conversation. "We planned to leave by fishing boat, but there were too many patrols near the anchorage yesterday. You brought us to this slaughterhouse. Do you have a way to take the goods out to sea?" Chapter 790. Naaman continued to smile, without saying a word. The wagon pulled into a storehouse, and a Japanese horseman in a leaden turban came up, unharnessed the mules, and led them to the stables at the back of the storehouse. "We have to stay here for 2 days." After changing into a cotton coat with cloud patterns and tying his fluffy black hair into a bun, Naaman put on a pair of wooden clogs with sawtooth studs and smeared some chalk powder on his body to disguise himself as a Japanese merchant. Naaman said to his 2 companions in a serious manner, "Although it's not very polite to say this, you don't think that you can fool the search team that might come at any time with your clumsy disguise, do you?" Oakfist retorted as he gestured to Naaman's height. "Unless they cut off a section of their legs, no matter how they disguise themselves, they would not be mistaken as Wusan merchants. We just need a small boat. If you can get it, then we can take the goods and leave King's Landing City." This lightning monk seemed to be a little anxious. Last night's large-scale manhunt had left a deep impression on him. Originally, they had come to King's Landing to steal the machine used to make banknotes. In order to successfully escape with the goods after he succeeded, he had already planned several transportation routes. In his opinion, the money-printing machine and the raw materials used to print money were definitely not small objects. Even if they were disassembled into parts, it was unlikely that they could be transported through a temporary portal. However, the intensity of the citywide manhunt yesterday had swept away his initial optimism. They had followed Naaman to the slaughterhouse wharf to see what tricks this tomb raider had up his sleeves. If he had really come to King's Landing to steal the soul-suppressing tomb, then he would have planned an escape route for himself. After all, only by transporting the goods out would he be able to claim the full bounty. "We can't leave now." Naaman firmly rejected Oakfist's suggestion. He was completely different from the tactful man he had been when he was on the sandbank outside the city. As if to match his tone, a few men with katanas ran over. Some of them were Wusan, but most of them were Ramsey natives. A short gun appeared in Ablenstad's hand, but the lightning monk stood in front of him, using his sleeve to cover his comrade. "What if someone comes to check later? Are we going to fight with them? Didn't you just say that the Japanese merchants here don't dare to provide shelter to anyone who disobeys the will of the scales of eternal order?" Naaman smiled. "Of course, those cowardly fellows won't." Then he changed the topic. "But the people of Tradewind Chamber of Commerce are different. They stored a lot of goods that they forgot to declare, so they won't let the search team conduct a thorough search. Besides, we won't stay in any building and cause trouble for our friends." As he spoke, he let out a whistle. The men with katanas immediately surrounded them. They did not launch an attack. Instead, they swiftly cut the ropes tied to the wide-tailed carriage and carried the big guy in the carriage. Ablenstadt had wrapped Tribulation in layers of linen and a large amount of dwarf glue so that his original form could no longer be seen. Holding a knife in one hand and carrying goods in the other, seeing such an inefficient way of working, the dwarf investigator could not help but mock through the speaker disguised as an exoskeleton. He was still holding the short gun in his hand. Now, many unexpected things had happened, and many of them were caused by himself. For example, he saved Naaman, who was involved in a tavern fight. This made him feel even worse. However, before he finished speaking, an accident suddenly happened, as if it was a slap in his face. The Tribulation General, who was wrapped in layers of linen bandages and looked like a mummy, suddenly trembled and turned around. His beast-like head smashed right into a Japanese servant who was moving with him on his back. The Japanese man let out a painful howl. His arm was torn open, and blood gushed out uncontrollably. He was lucky. Just when Leopard Man bit through the gauze with his sharp teeth and was about to open a hole in the man's aorta to suck some blood to replenish his strength, Naaman noticed something strange in time. The grave robber kicked the servant away and saved his life. He only left a wound on the servant's arm that looked tragic but was not fatal. "Hold him down, don't let him get blood, and get some gauze and glue," Naaman said. The dwarf investigator and the lightning monk also put away their thoughts and quickly stepped forward to help. The leopard man was once again tied up into an even more bloated mummy. Then, he was tied up several times with ropes from the docks by the servants. Finally, he was placed in a crate that was similar to a coffin. Next, they continued to carry Tribulation to a small dock behind the warehouse. Although it was called a dock, there was actually only one berth here. A small patrol boat used to drive away sharks, and Sawajan was now docked in this berth. Because there were whaling ships in and out of the slaughter dock all year round, the marine predators attracted by the whale meat casually thrown into the sea by the ships would occasionally follow the whaling ships in the nearby waters. For safety reasons, the Chamber of Commerce, which controlled the slaughter dock, would take out a sum of money every year to hire businesses here to drive small patrol boats and take turns to drive away the dangerous marine creatures. "Tell your people to keep their mouths shut." Naaman walked to the pier, took out a small wallet, took out some banknotes, and handed them to the leader of the Japanese servants. Then he sent the group of people away, leaving only him, the dwarf investigator, and the lightning monk here. He opened the rattan suitcase he carried with him, took out a large bottle of alchemy potion, and used a small brush to carefully apply the potion to every gap in the crate. "Done. When the waterproof latex dries, we will go into the water." "Go into the water?" Oak Fist glanced at him, and then looked at the small patrol boat that was in good condition. "This boat can still sail under the sea." He only said half a sentence before he took the initiative to shut his mouth. At the same time, he was secretly on guard. If Naaman had such an advanced vehicle, then his identity as a grave robber was really questionable. "It can't." As if he saw through Oak Fist's mind, Naaman smiled and explained, "But we can." Chapter 791. They went into the water. Fortunately, there was an old fishing net on the shore. Otherwise, without the net filled with stones, they wouldn't have been able to bring the crate to a depth of several meters. "I didn't expect you to have such a safe house," Oak Fist praised sincerely. He also cast a magical spell, a magic trick used by priests to dry the clothes on the three people. At this moment, the three of them, together with the crate, were staying in a tin house under the small patrol boat. The room was under the sea, and there was a hole at the bottom for them to enter and exit. The top of the room was equipped with a windbreak lamp, and the burning blubber candle inside emitted a light blue light. Under the dim light, they could also see a ventilation hole, which was connected to the bottom of the boat with a hose and rope. With the help of the small boat's hollow rudder, the few of them didn't have to worry about breathing. Naman's face showed an expression of wisdom. The search team will definitely check this place, but they won't find anything useful. As long as we wait for 2 days, when the wind blows over, we can escape from the port with the help of the small boat above. Oakfist glanced at Abscroder and saw him nodding. He immediately asked Naman, "How much commission do they want to give you? I mean, after the monster is handed over to those people." As he spoke, he kicked the crate. This action aroused Naman's vigilance. His face became serious, and the single-edged giant axe in his hand was raised a few inches, and the tip of the axe was aimed at the other two. "Don't worry," Oakfist waved his hand. "We won't do this to you. After this small boat tows the tin house out of the port, you must have arranged for a big ship to pick it up. What we really want is this route. We can give you 3 times the final payment of the client." Abscroder controlled the kinetic skeleton to extend 3 fingers. "As long as you can give up on this monster and help us transport something on this route." "Why?" Naman asked curiously. It was not entirely a disguise, but considering the current situation, curiosity was a normal emotion. "What valuable things do you want to transport? Also, when you were willing to help me, it wasn't because you wanted to split the commission with me, but because you wanted to test if I had a more suitable transportation channel." Lightning Monk and a midget investigator looked at each other and smiled when they saw his enlightened look. The two of them took a step away from each other, forming a kind of suppression towards Naman. Abscroder took out a large wallet and tossed it to the side of the door, revealing a thick stack of Lord's Landing banknotes. "Is it enough? This money should be enough to rent a slaughterhouse for a year." Naman licked his lips. This action was undoubtedly seen by the other two, but they did not say anything. "Double it." After a moment of silence, Naman said tentatively, "I won't ask too much. There is a saying among the pirates of Jorms, if you want to live long, learn to keep your mouth shut. But I still need to shut the mouths of the dozens of people on the transport ship in the open sea." And he thought for a moment, seeming to be weighing the pros and cons of making things clear, but in the end, the impulse to increase the price prevailed over caution. "You took this robber away, but you said you were interested in my transportation route. This means that in order to send that thing away, you may use this robber. In other words, this slaughterhouse may disappear." "Damn it," Naman grumbled. He seemed to have figured out the crux of the matter. "This is basically a last resort. The transportation route that I've painstakingly built can only be used once. No doubt about it, you have to pay more. 3 times the total, and you don't have a choice." Oakfist didn't wait for the dwarf investigator to bargain, as he immediately spoke. As he spoke, a flail flew out from his sleeve. "Live to get the money, or die without getting the money. You forced me to do this." Naman roared and took a step forward. His foot heavily stepped on the wallet thrown by Abscroder. "I choose money. Before the boat leaves the harbor, you have to pay the balance." It was another deal, and the terms of the contract had been successfully fulfilled. The 3 of them were no longer at loggerheads. Instead, they sat on the cold floor of the tin house and began to eat their dry food. After Oakfist had this simple breakfast, he habitually touched the back of his head, where there was a psionic power amplifier installed before he became an electric monk. In the past, most of the time, he used it to connect to and understand the games released by the gods. But today, after he used it to connect to the game, he began to post a short message in the chat bar. "Gold farming plan, start." Then, he directly closed the connection. "I'll be back soon." After he finished speaking, he carried the crate on the ground and jumped into the water from the passage under the tin house. The morning had passed, and the entire King's Landing city gradually woke up. After a night of rest, the production of the factory began to get back on track, and the streets of the commercial area gradually became lively. Although it was located in an inconspicuous corner of King's Landing City, the Slaughterhouse Wharf, like most areas, had now regained its vitality. Several factories, such as the Barrel Factory, the Whale Wax Processing Factory, and the Whale Blubber Refining Factory, were gradually in full swing. At the warehouse door next to the wharf, transport workers lined up in a long line. Today, they were going to transport the hundreds of barrels of whale blubber stored here. Some of it would be sent to the market of the Waysang Chamber of Commerce, and some of it would be sent to the factories around the wharf. However, this busy and silent work was interrupted by a mournful howl. The transport workers, pushing small carts, all involuntarily looked in the direction of the scream. As soon as the door of the warehouse was opened, a warehouse manager entered and checked the inventory. Immediately, there was a terrifying scream. The soldiers of the Xinfeng Chamber of Commerce, who were maintaining order nearby, hurriedly rushed over. They rushed into the wide, open warehouse, but what followed was even more miserable screams coming from inside. Not sure which transport worker with sharp eyes suddenly discovered that some kind of dark red liquid was slowly flowing down the slope of the warehouse door. "There's blood. There's a monster. Run." With this shout, all the workers left their carts and ran to the door of the warehouse area in panic. At the door of the warehouse, a hand with sharp claws was holding the door, supporting a slightly hunched body. Roar. Chapter 792. Fazak walked along the shore, the waves rolling in with white foam almost up to the tips of his boots. A snipe walked side by side with him in the distance, grabbing food in the rolling waves. When the waves receded, leaving the smooth, dark sand, a string of bubbles could be seen emerging from the buried sand lice. Greedy seagulls occasionally came down to enjoy breakfast, regardless of the presence of others. The orc was also eating breakfast, but he was very restrained. He only had a few slices of beef jerky and ale with a little honey. He had to stretch his body later, so he could not eat, but he couldn't eat too much either. Near him, there were dozens of fat and strong people of the same tribe. They were now busy checking their weapons and armor, or feeding a few fresh steaks to their dire wolf companions to deal with the next chase. "My lord," a Japanese man lay in front of Fazak. His head, hands, and knees were all buried in the wet sand. Perhaps it was because of fear, or perhaps it was because his clothes were wet from the sea and he felt cold, but he had been trembling slightly. Mataro could speak the official language of King's Landing City, but he had a serious Japanese accent, and his pronunciation was also stuttering. Meishing Chamber of Commerce only has a small share in the slaughterhouse dock. We really have nothing to do with that damn tomb robber. In the name of my ancestors. Ancestors? Fazak sneered. Of course, he knew that Tribulation's appearance at the slaughterhouse dock had nothing to do with this Japanese merchant in front of him. Although this person was the most powerful Japanese merchant in King's Landing City, it was certainly impossible for him to have contact with Lord Nariman. However, what did this have to do with today's plan? From the moment you established a cooperative relationship with the Reliance Wind Chamber of Commerce, which had various connections with Dwarf Island, you became the stumbling block of the scales of eternal order. Fazak kicked this stubborn stone in front of him, kicking Mataro, who was lying on the ground, for 5 steps away. The orc snorted. Irrelevant answer. He bared his fangs that protruded from his lower lip and said hatefully, "What I want is the land deed you signed." Not far away, several guards of the Meishing Chamber of Commerce seemed to become a little indignant when they saw their master being humiliated. However, the rows of warriors standing beside them, dressed in armor and wielding swords and shields, allowed them to maintain their rationality. Other than the wolf riders of his family and the orc warriors recruited from Sigil City and other places, the second security team, led by Fazak, had as many as 100 peripheral members. Because there were more Japanese immigrants in the city he was in charge of, most of the peripheral members hired by Fazak were Japanese. Unlike the jailers in charge of the prison, these people didn't come from Zhejiangjin. Instead, they were Dudi warriors from the major clans in Chuyan City. The word Dudi meant slave in the Japanese language. With the Japanese military system, the status of the Dudi warriors was far lower than that of the Free People swordsmen. They were not the main force at the start. However, after a long period of war, the number of freedmen who were willing to take the risk and join the army to seek a better future became fewer and fewer. Those Dudi warriors gradually became the backbone of the army. Keiji Asada, the head of the Qin clan who was attached to the scale of perpetual order, returned the favor after becoming a new major clan in Chuyan City. He collected a large number of Dudi warriors from the old major clans and gave them to the scale of perpetual order. With the protection of the Chamber of Commerce, they don't need additional armed forces. Fazak still remembered what Brock had told him. But the scale of perpetual order needs all kinds of resources, and we can always put the resources in the most suitable place, he thought to himself. Therefore, he asked for more than 100 Dudi warriors for his security team. Fazak only promised that his descendants would be given freedom and the right to education, and he easily won their loyalty. The secret spell runes used to restrain the Dudi warriors were still locked in the safe in his office, collecting dust until now. After pondering for a while, Fazak glanced at Mitaru again. The Japanese merchant still did not hand over the contract. He only took out a small cloth package from his sleeve. "My lord, this is a small token of my appreciation. You are welcome. I hope you can kindly accept it." Looking at the color exposed through the gaps of the cloth package, the orc knew the choice of the Japanese merchant in front of him. He couldn't help but open his big mouth and laugh. "Good little Judge Gold. Well, from the Japanese side, it seems that you have made a lot of money. However, a second ago, he was amiable, but it didn't mean that he would be the same in the next second." The orc wolf rider, who had always considered himself a war maniac, felt insulted, so he showed his true colors in front of Mitaro without any scruples. He let out a roar, and all the dire wolves raised their necks and howled in response. All the orcs showed a ferocious smile, and the commander let out a battle cry. The most anticipated moment of this bloodthirsty race was about to come. In addition to them, the Dudi warriors also reacted. In an instant, they surrounded the family guards of the Meishing Chamber of Commerce. They ignored the pleas and curses of the other party and focused on squeezing them one by one with their shields. Then, they used their short swords to continuously stab through the gaps. Only a few people let out cries of pain. Most of the guards of the Meishang family lost their lives before they could react. Their souls were not wasted. A few black-robed mages of the security team took the opportunity to charge a few obsidian magic orbs with energy. "I want the deed to the slaughterhouse wharf. That is the basis for your cooperation with the Truin Chamber of Commerce." Stepping on Mitaro's chest, Fazak bent down and looked into his eyes. "This will indeed allow you to obtain rich returns. But you have to consider, if you die, who will inherit the money you earned? Where will it be used?" Mitaro's face immediately showed signs of struggle. On one hand, it was because he was being stepped on by the orc, and, on the other hand, he was in a dilemma. The scales of eternal order advocated order, and King's Landing City, which was built by them, recognized the law of property. Back then, the Truin Chamber of Commerce in Ramses' native territory lacked the ability to hunt whales and produce goods near the shore. That was why they cooperated with the Meishing Chamber of Commerce, which had the right to use the slaughterhouse wharf for 20 years. Now, suspected grave robbers had appeared at the slaughterhouse wharf. If the scales of eternal order wanted to clean up and capture this place, it was likely to cause irreversible damage. They might even find evidence of tax evasion by the Meishing Chamber of Commerce and the Truin Chamber of Commerce. That was why Mitaro was unwilling to take out the deed and legally give the security team full authority to enter. But now, Fazak was starting to use violence without restraint. This made Mitaro completely abandon his original plan of resisting. If the Truin Chamber of Commerce doesn't clean up the evidence of tax evasion, then the Meishing Chamber of Commerce can only accept our bad luck. If we're going to die, let's die together. I can't be the only one fighting to the end. Mitaro finally made up his mind. He took out a brass scroll from his sleeve and begged for mercy. "The title deed is in here." Chapter 793. Aegon paced nervously. As the plenipotentiary of the Chamber of Commerce in King's Landing City, this was the first time in 2 years that he had lost his calm, aristocratic bearing. He was originally a noble of Red Pine City. Later, he married into the Chamber of Commerce and became one of the core members of his family. In order to live a rich and comfortable life, he gave up the dignity of a noble. Although there were 2 or 3 villages in his fief, an old fortress passed down from his ancestors, and a few nights, it was difficult to define it as respectable, but he had still paid a price. So at this moment, because of an accident that should not have happened and could possibly make all his previous efforts go to waste, Aegon was so anxious. The room was filled with the smell of cedar. There was a stove near the gable wall. Aegon pressed the sword at his waist and looked around the room. For a moment, he thought he was in a forest in the wild. The room was made of many unskinned tree trunks, which were directly used as the pillars. The room was dimly lit. The floor was stone slabs, and sawdust filled the gaps. Many small insects with hard shells were running around. Beside Aegon were some old tables that were no longer in use. They were scarred by fire at some point in time. The sour smell of distiller's grains filled the room. It smelled like an abandoned brewery. The windows were tightly shut, and only a small crack let in light. It was also used to exchange air. Why did they choose this place? Aegon thought with some resentment. He guessed that some people in the Chamber of Commerce were deliberately trying to make things difficult for him. So in the Chamber of Commerce's emergency plan manual, this tavern, which had been abandoned for 4 or 5 years and was originally called Del Apex, was designated as the Emergency Command Center. Of course, this was only one of the many prejudiced guesses he had made over the years. In fact, before the Chamber of Commerce chose this place as the Emergency Command Center, they had arranged for many secret inspections. It could be said that they had put in a lot of effort. The abandoned Del Apex Tavern was located on the outskirts of the slaughterhouse area, less than 500 steps away from the nearby commercial street operated by the Lisong Chamber of Commerce. If the situation really reached an irreversible point, the people hiding here could quickly escape to the commercial street through an underground passage and disguise themselves as merchants or customers there. In addition to the escape route, this place had also been specially renovated by the Xian Feng Chamber of Commerce. Although it looked dilapidated, the building materials were actually very sturdy. Furthermore, ceramic pipes were secretly buried in the key buildings of the slaughterhouse wharf to allow the messenger lizards to pass through quickly. If there really was a problem, staying in this emergency command center would not only allow him to quickly obtain the latest news from all over the place, but he would also be able to provide support and remote command. Damn it! How long are they going to keep this up? Aegon muttered. After that, he ignored the advice of the 2 consultants arranged for him by the Chamber of Commerce and insisted on wearing a set of knight armor stamped with family patterns. If we have to go through that underground passage, it means that we might encounter a battle. Nobles must use armor to protect themselves, he announced loudly. The counselor had no choice but to indulge Aegon in exchange for peace. According to the latest message Lizard, the 3 security squads of King's Landing City had already led their squads into the slaughterhouse docks. With the unreliable son-in-law boss yelling, it was likely to attract unnecessary attention and cause the emergency command center to give up prematurely. Just as Aegon fastened the last belt around his waist with the help of his attendants, the counselors who were guarding a row of pipes had also eagerly awaited the arrival of the mailman. 5 messenger lizards with reddish-brown skin that looked like small iguanas crawled out of the pipes one by one. The air sacs on their necks bulged slightly, indicating that their mouths were full of messages. The counselors extended their fingers and skillfully touched the stripes on the back of the messenger lizards. The little mailmen who had been trained immediately opened their mouths. They began to speak human language. In fact, they were just like a tape recorder, recording and playing the last few sentences they heard. They did not understand the meaning behind the words. The counselors listened nervously. The news came from the family guards who were sent to clean up the warehouse. In the entire slaughterhouse docks, there were a total of 5 warehouses with undeclared goods stored in them. They were all goods with extremely high profits. However, if those goods were discovered, the Tradewind Merchant Guild would most likely face a fine of 100 times the total value of the goods. It was too late to transport them away, so Aegon could only order his men to destroy them quickly. Have they been cleaned up? When Aegon saw that the counselors had received the news, he could not help but touch the buckle on his armor. If they had confirmed that those goods had been destroyed, there was no need for him to escape. 4 warehouses have been cleaned up, only 1 is left. The counselor who was speaking hesitated for a moment before continuing. There's still a few sand rhinos bought from the Grand Bazaar in the last warehouse. They're the breeding beast that Dwarf Island wants to buy through us. The gnome escorts did not allow our guards to destroy the goods. And then, are the blades, swords, and spring steel crossbows in the hand of the guards just for show? Aegon lifted his helmet mask and vented his dissatisfaction with a hoarse voice. The counselors could only explain to him. Those gnomes are big customers of the guild. Half of our blubber will be sold to Dwarf Island, so that is the guild's concern, not your and my responsibility. Aegon interrupted the counselor. As a noble, he was more or less clear about the rules of authority than the haggard merchants. But if we lose the slaughterhouse docks, then you and I will have to bear the responsibility. There's no excuse. So, do you know what to do? Yes. After being enlightened, the men also realized that they were just paid as counselors. There was no need for them to worry about their boss. The counselor squeezed the air out of the messenger lizard and immediately handed it to Aegon. The plenipotentiary of the Tradewind Merchant Guild in King's Landing announced in a strict tone. Clean up that warehouse. Note that I said clean up. He repeated it and emphasized the key words. He believed that the council on the other side should be able to understand what he meant. As long as the counselors did as he was told, he could push the blame to the family guards. The next thing to consider is who brought that damned monster into the docks. And where is he hiding now? Aegon thought to himself. Although he also felt that the armor was a little heavy, he did not loosen the button to unlock it. Chapter 794. Leopard Man squatted down in a corner of the gloomy lumber factory. On one side of him was a warehouse, and on the other side was the busiest barrel factory in the slaughterhouse wharf in the past. The ground between the two was littered with broken iron hoops, pieces of lath, and planks. He had just had a full meal and regained some strength. He even got a pot of brandy from a guard hut in the warehouse. Tribulation took out the pot, moistened his lips, and drank 2 mouthfuls. The last time he woke up was 12 years ago. At that time, he was in a hurry to perform a task, so he did not have a good meal and get drunk. Today, he would kill a lot of people, but killing did not occupy his consciousness. The desire to live occupied his body and mind more deeply than brutality. His brutality came quickly and violently, but the feeling of thirst, like that of a drowning person who was rescued, was deeply immersed in the depths of his heart, and there was no end to it. I must escape from King's Landing, Leopard Man thought to himself. In addition to his unparalleled speed, Tribulation had some other abilities. By drinking blood, he could not only replenish his strength, but also obtain some memories of the blood's owner. So, after drinking the blood of the stevedores, the guards of the Chamber of Commerce, and a few Wusong merchants, he had some understanding of his current situation. Although he did not want to believe it, the memories of those people told him without exception that the emperor had died more than 10 years ago. And this city, called King's Landing by the Ramsay people, was the end of the emperor's hegemony. The emperor is not dead, or I can't be resurrected, Leopard Man thought firmly. But now I must escape. Sitting on top of an abandoned blubber barrel, he rested while carefully examining his surroundings. He wanted to sort out the information about the various roads and the wall he was about to climb from the memories he obtained. When he heard a man's voice, he stood up and slowly took a step forward. A few people walked into the warehouse beside him. Through the gap in the corner of the wall, Leopard Man squinted his eyes and looked inside. There were a few black shadows that did not have any distinguishing features. They seemed to be 5 men who were having a rather intense conversation with the 3 gnomes who were in charge of the goods. However, it didn't take long for the verbal exchange between the 2 sides to come to an end. They began to use weapons to converse. The 5 men in dark brown robes lifted their robes at the same time, without any warning. They took out 5 loaded crossbows and shot the 3 gnomes in front of them to death. The 3 little gnomes fell to the ground, falling noiselessly onto a layer of cinders on the floor. The Leopard Man felt a thirst surging in his body. He took a deep breath and exhaled a breath that smelled of brandy. Tribulation could not help but warn himself This is the last time. With that thought in mind, a sinister smile blossomed on his cheeks like a leopard's. 5 prey, 5 times the fun. A breeze with the smell of salty seawater blew over, and there was no one in the corner between the warehouse and the factory. A vigorous figure quickly climbed up the wall, lying on the metal ceiling of the warehouse, quietly sneaking around. Outside the slaughterhouse, the 3 teams of the Monarch's Landing Security Bureau had already assembled. Their officers were a Goliath berserker, an orc wolf rider, and a gray dwarf supervisor. The core strength of these 3 teams were elite warriors of the same race as their captains. They gathered here to seal off any communication between this private wharf and the entire Monarch's Landing city. Because this area was under Fizak's jurisdiction, the Orc Wolf Rider and the 200 duty warriors under his command would be the main force against Tribulation when the operation plan was drawn up. The other 2 security teams were only their reinforcements. Their mission was to suppress the disobedient Tradewind Merchant Guild and demolish the buildings that hindered the battle. Little bastards, come with me and flatten this place. Fazak roared in orc language, and the members of his family all roared along. The dire wolves under them also let out cruel howls. Then, the 100 or so orcs and wolves all rushed into the entrance. In groups of 3, they rode their dire wolves and galloped down the alleys, as if they were fishing with a net, towards the entire slaughterhouse wharf. As a Goliath berserker, Shatterbear Chieftain couldn't help but laugh when he saw his old partner in high spirits. He was the captain of the Monarch's Landing Security Bureau's first team. Apart from his own warriors, he also had dozens of camel warriors and polar bear men under his command. In the past, the polar bear men had long been unhappy with this business district where whales were slaughtered. Now he could fulfill the promise he had made to his subordinates in the past. Tear down those whale processing plants for me. With Goliath Berserker's order, the warriors that were stacked together as tall as 2 Ramsey humans instantly became excited. They carried heavy warhammers and battle axes, wore thick armor, and marched towards the illegal buildings that had already been marked out. The last one to act was the Duergar supervisor named Husk. He was originally one of the mercenaries under Kitha's command from the Bator Plain. After participating in the construction of Traction in the Bottomless Abyss, some of the Grey Dwarves, including Husk, were chosen by the Desert Elf Brock to become law enforcers like Fazak and Shatterbear Chieftain to maintain order in the city. Originally, Husk wasn't the chief of the Grey Dwarves. However, during an operation to capture spies in Traction, Husk's chief was unfortunately killed. That was why Husk, who was originally a supervisor, was promoted and became the new leader of the Grey Dwarves forces. Due to the lesson of his predecessor, he became very cautious in his actions. The peripheral personnel under his command were all expert spies for various races. Before the operation, 2 Japanese spies in the Meishing Chamber of Commerce had told him that the Frestek Chamber of Commerce had a secret passage that led to the outside of the slaughterhouse dock. The starting point of the secret passage was an emergency command center of the Chamber of Commerce. After the operation began, none of the Grey Dwarves under him rushed into the docks. They all took out the detection tools they carried with them. Enchanted steel staffs that were twisted together with chains and had a concave barb at one end. The Grey Dwarves pieced the steel staffs together to form a long stick that was more than 10 feet long. They constantly activated the magic on it, and then deeply embedded it into the ground. They only needed to rotate the stick once to check the soil underground, and they would be able to tell if there was soil that didn't belong to the docks. This area was close to the sea, and the soil content was too high, so it wasn't suitable for digging a tunnel. Therefore, for the tunnel to be excavated, it must have been lined with some waterproof material. They now needed to find the rat hole of the Tradewind Merchant Guild. Chapter 795. Found it. With the tireless efforts of the many Duergar warriors, who were also very good miners, they quickly found a secret passage that connected the slaughterhouse wharf to the nearby Wusong commercial street. Husk glanced at the timer in his hand. The second hand had just turned 10 times. Not 1 second more, not 1 second less. The Duergar supervisor nodded with satisfaction. Start digging. Ripper Squad, attack from underground. Ho-ho, Radug above. The Duergar, who had been crowned with the title of Ripper as they chanted the name of their god, jumped into the hole dug by their compatriots one after another. They gathered in the tunnel and directly rushed to the end of the path. These Duergar did not carry any additional weapons. They themselves were very dangerous weapons. On the surface of their cold, iron armor, which was the same color as their dark skin, sharp spikes covered every joint. On the top of their metal helmet, there was a sharp chisel, which they called the third fist. Thanks to their innate night vision, moving underground was a piece of cake for the Ripper. Their sparkling eyes could even see the tiny cracks on every stone in the secret passage. With heavy footsteps, the group of barbed metal cans quickly found their way to the end of the secret passage. There was a reinforced oak door there as a barrier. Without any hesitation, the two Duergar Rippers at the front took large strides and ran, and then crashed into the door like cannonballs. And two of them at once. The oak door was very sturdy, and it did not shatter after the impact. But this time, wood was stronger than metal, and the metal hinges connecting the door to the wall were torn apart. The thick door fell backward, and the two Duergar in charge of breaking the door rolled into the emergency command center of the Chamber of Commerce. Ho-ho! A total of 20 Rippers shouted at the same time, and then swarmed into the entrance like a swarm of bees. None of the Rippers wanted to help the two Duergar who had fallen on the ground. They thought that the two Duergar had already found some entertainment for themselves, and now it was their turn. The Rippers opened their arms and enthusiastically opened their arms to the stunned members of the Chamber of Commerce. Husk stood at the entrance of the slaughterhouse wharf with a pair of brass binoculars in his hand. He was well aware of the Ripper Squad's modus operandi. Even though he didn't know the exact location of the emergency command center, he could tell where the chaos was, where the most miserable howls were, and where the severed limbs were flying about. That was all he needed to know. When he saw a building for the third time, it was an abandoned tavern with a broken signboard. It was as if a barrel of gunpowder had exploded inside. First, the wooden windows suddenly shattered, and some chairs, tables, and even human body parts were thrown out from inside. Then, there was a tragic scream, like a piece of rag being torn apart. Musket team. Husk picked up the brass binoculars again and looked at the words on the broken door plaque. Target, Delphi Point Tavern. Line up and charge. He didn't tell his men the exact location of the tavern, but it didn't matter. How could those musketeers, who were holding long-barreled flintlocks and could hit an elk from 2 miles away, not see the building that was erupting? The answer was of course no. The Duergar musketeers saw the target at first glance. They were even faster than Husk with the brass binoculars. However, as a creature of order, they were more willing to listen to their superior's orders on the battlefield. After the supervisor gave the order, they could no longer hold back their hunting instincts. Bang, bang, bang. Some of the musketeers pulled the trigger from afar, and 3 rounds of ammunition were fired in an instant. The smoke from the gunpowder covered the smiles on their faces, and at the same time, blocked the angry stares of their companions. How could they be so immoral? Didn't they know that this was the common prey of all the Duergar musketeers? Didn't they know that shooting at close range made hunting more enjoyable? Nevertheless, the role of an example was endless. Someone had set a bad example, and the Duergar musketeers could no longer hide their treacherous racial characteristics. They ran 2 steps forward, raised their guns, and then hid to the side to quickly reload their flintlocks with 3 rounds of ammunition. In about 2 or 3 breaths, the bullets wrapped in solidified gunpowder would be fired from the muzzle again. In a short distance of less than 200 steps, the 40-plus musketeers had unleashed a torrent of nearly 1,000 bullets at the abandoned Delphi Point Tavern. By the time they had broken through the tavern's door, there were no other standing enemies other than the Rippers who were clad in thick, cold steel armor. Even the tables and chairs were no exception. The Ripper team did not have a good impression of their colleagues who came to support in time. From their point of view, these guys were shooting randomly with long pipes were doing more harm than good. They had wiped out more than half of the fun they could find in an instant. See if there's anyone still breathing. Supervisor Husk came in later. He sniffed the air, which was filled with a strange mixture of smoke and blood. He immediately gave the latest order. Send a medical team and let them do some simple treatment. Then, send them all to Sir Paru's medical camp. But before sending them away, make sure everyone's identity is confirmed. Whether it's missing an arm or a leg, but still alive, or dead on the ground. As he spoke, he caught a glimpse of a human who was being held in a corner by a few Ripper team members. He was the one with the lightest injury in the emergency command center of the Truin Chamber of Commerce. He only had a bullet wound on his arm that was not serious. Thanks to the knight armor he was wearing, although it was not tough enough, it was gorgeous enough. Aegon was immediately recognized by the Ripper team as the highest decision-maker here. He was well protected. The Rippers were especially careful when they hit him with their fists. They did not use the spikes on the front of their gloves, which had excellent armor-piercing properties. Instead, they used a slightly smoother fist socket. Moreover, when the Duergar musketeers rained bullets down on him, the Rippers specially separated 2 or 3 of them to firmly pin Aegon to the ground, which prevented him from being shot into a sieve. It was a pity that the good luck of the former noble of Red Pine, the current representative of the Truin Chamber of Commerce in King's Landing, and the future prisoner of the Scales of Eternity, came to an end. After receiving treatment without anesthesia, such as wound cleaning and bandaging, he was directly sent to a secret prison by Husk. Unlike the public prison in King's Landing City, this prison was private. Most of the time, it served as Snader's laboratory warehouse. Only a few times, it became the place where the Demolic tortured prisoners. Put a mask on him and disguise him. Go and come back quickly. After you come back, take a week of paid leave. Husk, who had some understanding of the prison, gave his subordinates some benefits when he gave the order. Chapter 796. Those little shorties are really in full swing. The leader of the Goliath clan, Shredded Bear, heard the gunshots in the distance and couldn't help but laugh. Then the warrior transformed by Leviathan returned to his half-Goliath, half-mammoth appearance. He stretched his body, and his 2 front legs, which were as thick as pillars, stomped on the ground. A formless shockwave radiated out in all directions with him as the center. His tall subordinates couldn't help but stop what they were doing to keep their balance. "Sorry," Shredded Bear said without any sincerity. Then he waved his arm and slammed the steam hammer, which was as large as an adult's head, on a stone load-bearing pillar next to him. The tremendous force of the hammer, coupled with the additional power provided by the steam hammer, directly smashed the stone load-bearing pillar, which was as thick as an adult's waist, in half. The other Goliaths, polar bear men, and camel warriors saw this and hurriedly ran out of the blubber candle factory. Just as they hurriedly evacuated, the 3-story factory was like a sandcastle destroyed by a naughty child. It instantly fell apart. Plasterboards, wooden wallboards, and some stone fragments heavily hit the ground and raised a circle of dust. Fortunately, the goal of this operation was already clear, and all the soldiers responsible for the demolition work carried labor protection supplies distributed by the Chamber of Commerce. Through the tempered glass goggles on the fully sealed pig mouth gas masks, they all looked at the leader standing in the ruins in awe. "I didn't use much force, and this thing collapsed." Shredded Bear curled his lips. Because of the large protective mask, his loud voice was particularly low. Obviously, this is definitely not the work of the Scales of Eternity construction team. "You guys like to show off." Fazak, who was leading the team through the streets and alleys of the slaughterhouse wharf, immediately understood what happened when he heard the sound of the building being demolished. He stroked the back of his dire wolf companion's head and comforted the frightened old man. "Don't worry, we will also have a wonderful hunt." As expected, the moment the second cannon shot sounded, 2 wolf riders from the main house ran in front of Fazak as fast as they could. With their outstanding horsemanship, they instantly avoided the saddle and jumped off the back of the dire wolf. Then he rolled twice on the ground, easily reducing the impact of the fall. At the same time, he crawled in front of Fazak. Father Jean. The 2 wolf riders were Fazak's children. They said almost in unison, "The wolf cubs have found the victims killed by Tribulation. They have locked onto Tribulation's location. "Father Jean, please allow the wolf riders to pull in the net." "I?" The two orc wolf riders looked at each other with hostility. Fazak knew what his sons were thinking, so he naturally gave each of them a whip. The glory of the hunt belongs to the entire house of Fazak. "And I am your chieftain," Fazak arrogantly gave an obvious conclusion. "First, order all the wolf riders to prepare to pull in the net. Second, order warrior Dudi to surround that building and launch a wave charge at it first." The order was simple and direct, which was in line with the nature of the orcs. Zhang Kuang knew how to use his unique words to arouse the enthusiasm of the entire clan for battle. Fazak also knew that his sons coveted the power of the chieftain. Not only was he always ready to beat those rebellious young men to the ground, but he was also mentally prepared for the future when he would be replaced. But what could he do? Since the first day he became the chieftain of the clan, he knew that this kind of challenge would accompany him. Fazak was never afraid of it. He was just a little worried about whether those little bastards could learn half of his skills. Not only the way of killing, but also the way of ruling the clan, maintaining loyalty and reverence to the strongest, and so on. Therefore, he would not let go of any group action because that was the best classroom. Fazak wanted to pass on his survival wisdom to the next successor as much as possible. Of course, there was a prerequisite. Those little bastards had to be smart enough. "I hope so." Fazak shook his head as he looked at his two sons who turned around to gather their subordinates. They thought that they had not been discovered fighting, hitting each other with their elbows, and he said, "Maybe I have to have a few more." His reverie only stopped for a moment before it quickly slipped away from his mind. More than 100 dire wolves and the orc knights on their backs quickly gathered together. The Wazena warriors, twice the number of the orc wolf riders, had also completed their formation. Fazak pulled out a long whip from his waist and cracked it on the ground with a thunderclap. "The target is the warehouse in front. Warrior Dudi, launch a wave charge." The orc wolf riders' battle roar soared into the sky and almost reached the outside of the slaughterhouse dock. "Don't leave a single living thing alive. As long as they can move inside, kill them all." Upon hearing the order, more than 200 Dudai warriors immediately divided into more than 20 combat groups. Each group was led by those who held oars and swords, and those who held battlements at the back. Each group also had 4 to 5 archers who were armed with muskets. Originally, Warrior Dudi was only regarded as consumables in the Wusong army. In every battle, the general commanding the army would order them to launch a suicidal charge. Although these slave warriors fought bravely and tenaciously, due to the lack of equipment and training, there would be a large number of casualties in every battle. But now, even if they were not equipped with the best armor and weapons of the scales of eternity, everyone's equipment was vastly different from before. Moreover, after the training of the wave charge, they were no longer in the low-efficiency mode of exchanging life for life. They learned to cooperate and attack the enemy layer by layer like a wave. The oars opened the way, the battlements killed the enemy, and the muskets were used to suppress the enemy. Many times before, when suppressing groups that were not disciplined and dared to form private armed forces in King's Landing City, Warrior Dudi only used a single wave to cut down all the enemies. Among them were the local bandits of Ramsey, but at the same time, there were many merchant families that migrated from Wusong. They did not feel any pressure before they faced the orc. Everyone, including Fazak, thought that 200 Warrior Dudi launching a wave charge to deal with a monster was actually a bit of a bully. However, this was not the case. Chapter 797. Warriors Dudi rushed into the warehouse. A heavy iron oak door was pushed open by the warriors with oars. There were many crates stacked inside. They found a large hole in the ceiling made of white iron, and sawdust was everywhere in a radius of dozens of yards. Like bulls ready to charge, the 20 teams of warriors went back and forth in the aisles between the crates, but they could not find any trace of the robber. "He might be hiding," the leader of the team said decisively. "Open these crates." Although they did not have crowbars or other tools, fortunately, The swords they carried were very sharp. At the very least, it was not difficult to cut open the soft boards made of sawdust. Ping, ping, bang, bang. After a series of slashing, the whole warehouse was soon filled with the smell of sawdust. The air was filled with dust, dancing under the sunlight that shone through the hole in the ceiling. A large number of bones were scattered from the broken crates. They were originally piled up inside, as if they were neatly organized by some pervert. They look like human bones, but they are not the same. They seem to have been distorted. The leader of the warriors, Do Dai's face froze. He immediately thought of something. They're the bones of those monsters. This warehouse stores a large number of monster bones. The reason he could recognize these monster bones was that there was a time when the warriors Do Dai were ordered to help a certain master of the scale of perpetual order bury a lot of these things. After the Battle of the Protrusion more than 10 years ago, all the dead monsters were reused. However, there were still some losses in the process of recycling, and these losses were turned into waste. Soon, the situation in the warehouse was learned by Fazak, who was waiting outside. When the Orc Wolf Rider heard the news, he could not help but frown. This slaughterhouse is still smuggling contraband? He waved his hand. Let the black-robed mages do some work. Then, the two spellcasters summoned a few lively air elemental creatures. They ran into the door of the warehouse and immediately came out, covered in dust and the smell of death. A few dire wolves that had been scented earlier walked forward and sniffed. Then, they let out a long, low growl. The leopard man is still hiding in this warehouse. There's a new smell of blood mixed in. The Orc Wolf Rider, standing next to them, immediately judged the message their companions wanted to convey. They reported it to the chieftain. Let the black-robed mages find the blood in there and blast it with spells. Fazak ordered decisively. Two black-robed mages immediately walked through the door of the warehouse. Under the protection of many duty warriors, they summoned an amber ball of light that was spinning randomly. They observed everything around them through the ball of light. Not even the slightest blood could hide under this spell. Not long after, they locked onto their target. Here, the two men in black robes reached an agreement. They took out some dried bat feces from their pockets and crushed them into powder. Fireball. Two fireballs shot out from their fingertips and hit a pile of wooden crates. The warriors Do Dai, who were holding large oars, quickly stood in front of the mages and blocked the splashing wooden thorns and shockwaves for the two weak spellcasters. A few fresh corpses, still steaming hot, appeared in the broken pieces of the crates. There was no blood on the ground, and the warriors who went forward to check did not see even a piece of internal organs. The broken corpses had large holes from the throat to the lower abdomen, and the heart and liver inside had disappeared. As for the whereabouts of the organs, it was obvious. Just as the spellcasters were about to continue their bombardment, many people heard a slight scraping sound. Crackle, crackle, creak, creak, creak. It was very light and shallow, but it did exist. It was near them. A warrior holding a long battleship suddenly roared, "Over there!" Everyone looked in the direction he pointed and saw something squatting on top of a pile of crates. The guy looked a bit like a human, but his eyes were blood red, his feet were on the ground, and his skin was like a colorful tiger. He moved as smoothly as a mountain stream. After being discovered, he slipped away from the top of the pile of crates in the blink of an eye. The warriors Do Dai pushed the pile of crates and surged forward vigilantly with swords and knives. They did not believe that there was something that was completely invulnerable, but the leopard man was strong, agile, cunning, and fierce. Swords and knives were not a threat to him, and this was soon confirmed. Just when everyone thought they were approaching the target, one of the two black-robed mages who fell behind screamed. He was pulled out of his stomach by Tribulation, who suddenly jumped out from the side. The other black-robed mage was lucky to escape because he had reserved a protective spell for himself. When the leopard man pounced on him, a crackling spell flashed on the mage's body. Blue electric light flashed in the air. Tribulation's sharp claws just touched his robe and triggered the lightning shield on it. He had no choice but to retreat temporarily. Take that mage out. Captain Do Dai had run over and issued the latest order. Everyone else, Keep your spirits up, lower the tip of the spear, and follow up with the handlers. Leave a distance of 4 or 5 steps. If there's any movement, shoot. Everyone stepped on the broken pieces of the sawn boards on the ground, and from time to time, there would be a creaking sound. Step by step, the atmosphere of fear gradually condensed. Bang! One of the handlers saw a black shadow, so he pulled the trigger. Everyone was startled, but when they looked through the smoke, there was no sign of the leopard man, only the broken pieces of wood scattered all over the ground. Bah! Captain Dudai swallowed a mouthful of phlegm and roared twice like a raging volcano. There was not even a ghost shadow. However, at this moment, something suddenly fell from the ceiling. It was as black as the essence of the night, and as fast as sudden death. Many people could only think of the words "so fast" before the leopard man fell into the crowd. Several warriors with battlements rushed forward, but the aisle in the middle of the crates made the formation a little tricky, and they got in each other's way. Tribulation roared. Its sharp teeth and claws were so fast that it was difficult to see with the naked eye. What was even more worrying was that his claws and fangs were too sharp. Even the fine iron armor worn by the Dudi warriors could not withstand his attack. The remaining black-robed mage was ready to cast a spell. He took out a small handful of owl feathers and quickly crushed them with his thumb and index finger. Then, he decisively chanted a spell to add a layer of owl's insight to the handlers and battlements closest to him. Calm down. This monster was once beaten to death by a punch. The black-robed mage exposed the leopard man's past to everyone. Although his movements are fast, as long as we can stop him from moving, we can completely replicate what Master Lu did. Chapter 798. The unrestrained malice made everyone in the warehouse feel it. Everyone felt as if a piece of sandpaper was scraping the back of their neck and cheeks. The temperature around the leopard man seemed to have dropped by a few degrees. His blood-red eyes were wide open. With a whoosh, like an arrow leaving the bow, General Tribulation swept past the teams of duty warriors. They didn't even see the monster shadow. Advocate, the leopard man roared. Are your words better than those guys' swords? He pounced on the black-robed mage. The fact that the other party had just revealed deeply hurt the self-proclaimed top predator. Ignoring the lightning shield on the other party's body, General Tribulation endured the crackling electric current that exploded on the other party's body and stabbed his claws into the other party's chest and abdomen. Creak! The sound of a spring being stretched was heard. Words are better than swords. The black-robed mage, or rather, a puppet that had combined necromancy and the technology of building constructs, opened its mouth and mocked unscrupulously, especially for those who have no tolerance. In a moment, the robe that covered the puppet was ripped apart, revealing the enormous beast trap that was made of bones, metals, and the flesh of the creatures inside. General Tribulation's 2 sharp claws were firmly stuck between its ribs at this moment. Like a spider or an octopus, 8 artificial legs suddenly stretched out from the puppet's body. They quickly closed in the opposite direction and tightly bound the leopard man's body. Every restraint point was designed perfectly, and they were all stuck at the joints that General Tribulation used to exert force. Bazinga! The puppet loudly chanted an incantation of unknown meaning. Then, its skull instantly split into 2 from the middle, turning into a shape similar to a man-eating petal. The steam ejection device on its neck suddenly activated, and General Tribulation's head was suddenly held in its mouth. Perhaps it was more appropriate to describe it as confinement. After all, although the puppet's fierce bite was strong, the muscles and bones of the leopard man's neck were also very hard, so it couldn't crush him in an instant. However, no matter what, General Tribulation was really defeated this time. Not only the muscles on his body and the sharp claws on his fingertips, but he couldn't even count on the sharp teeth in his mouth. The leopard man had really become a huge leopard that had stepped into a death trap. Drag him out of this warehouse. Without any hesitation, the Dudai warriors immediately charged forward. They inserted their machetes into the gap between the leopard man and the puppet and carried the monster towards the warehouse door. The commander of the second security team was waiting there. At the same time, 2 streets away, Oak Fist walked out of the shadows that covered his body. Lightning Monk had just summoned a spell lens and saw Leopard Man being carried out of the warehouse by warriors Dudi. Making things convenient for others is also making things convenient for yourself, he muttered to himself. Perhaps you still need some other help. Oak Fist took out a piece of talc from his bosom and silently recited the prayer of divine summoning in his heart. The small round stone in his hand was quickly covered with a layer of earthy yellow light. Go! He threw the stone into the sky. The stone leaped into the clouds with a whoosh. Then, like a balloon that had been inflated by a pump, its volume instantly expanded by thousands of times. Then, under the influence of gravity, its trajectory changed from flying to falling. Amidst everyone's exclamations, this huge stone, about 2 yards in diameter, fell from the sky and smashed right into Leopard Man, who was tightly surrounded by warriors Dudi. Even though Fazak had reacted in time and ordered all the gunners to fire the projectiles in an attempt to deflect or at least reduce the momentum of the falling boulder, the boulders still hit the Tribulation General, who was restrained by the trap puppets. With a loud bang, in an instant, the huge stone turned into thousands of fragments and shot out in all directions. Because they were too close, many of the Dudi warriors' fine iron tools were smashed and clanked, and they were beaten back. Be on guard. Fazak threw away the whip in his hand and immediately took out a machete and a short gun that had been enchanted from the saddlebag of the dire wolf under him. The other orc wolf riders followed suit and pulled out their weapons. As for the Dudi warriors, they immediately changed their formation. While a portion of them defended the corners of the street, a group of warriors with large oars surrounded the Leopard Man, who was smashed into an iron bucket. The orc wolf rider raised the muzzle to the sky and decisively pulled the trigger. A special bullet filled with alchemy powder flew out and exploded into a cloud of dark blue smoke in the air. He was asking for help from the other 2 security forces. Whether it was Husk, who was conducting a large-scale search for the members of the Chamber of Commerce, or Shredded Bear Head, who was busy demolishing the house, after seeing Fazak's signal flare, they immediately rushed to the place of the accident without any hesitation. They all knew Fazak's character very well. If it was not really a big trouble, that conceited orc warrior would never think of asking for help from his colleagues. It's done. After receiving the information from a few mystic eyes, the Lightning Monk's mouth curved into a smile. Now it's up to the investigator whether you can make it in time. But I feel that this is a very safe move. Thinking of this, he looked at Naaman, who was standing beside him. You can start preparing now. After a third an hourglass, we will sneak into the underwater cabin on time. Remember to clean up all the traces left behind. After saying this, the Lightning Monk no longer paid attention to him and turned to the dwarf investigator who was going to the core industrial area of King's Landing City to steal. Compared to Oak Fist, a Blowstat who was wearing an exoskeleton disguise was actually the core of their mission this time. After all, among all the members of the mercenary group, including Oak Fist, only that guy had a pair of magical hands and was good at opening all kinds of locks. At the same time, thanks to his racial talent, he was also a powerful illusion master. They had already discussed the division of labor before. The Lightning Monk would stay at the slaughterhouse dock and monitor the activities of Leopard Man. If necessary, he would provide some help to the monster. A Blowstat would take this opportunity to create a diversion and go ahead to carry out the theft. Calculating the time, regardless of whether the operation at the banknote printing factory was successful or not, he was actually almost done on his side. At this time, he was most likely rushing to the private dock prepared by Naaman. Therefore, Oak Fist wanted to add some chaos to Leopard Man's side so that he could help a Blowstat smoothly sneak into the restricted area sealed by the King's Landing City Security Bureau. Chapter 799. The sound of metal rubbing against the ground came from not far away. The Lightning Monk knew that Ablenstadt had returned. When he turned his head to look at the street corner not far away, he could only see a crooked jujube tree standing there. How could there be a jujube tree? This was the private wharf of the Chamber of Commerce. The local profiteers of Ramsey would not listen to the advice of the Scales of Eternal Order, of course, it was not a rule. They would plant a few jujube trees for the commercial district. So, they planted fruit trees? Oak Fist was a little confused, but he soon realized that this was the dwarf's illusion trick. Not only did it mislead people visually, but it also set up a logical trap that was impossible to guard against. 20 breaths. The dwarf investigator had already walked up to him, carrying a bulging bag on his shoulder. Oak Fist did not know what tricks he used, but the bag did not make a sound when he bumped into it. "Did you get what we need?" Oak Fist took the initiative to change the topic. He did not want Ablenstadt to continue to ridicule him. They had already competed 3 times before, but each time he could not see through the opponent's illusion in 20 breaths. According to the dwarf, "If we were enemies, this long time would be enough for me to sneak up behind you, put the barrel to the back of your head, and pull the trigger." The lightning monk hated these things, whether it was the illusion tricks he used or the way he spoke. "Fisk," Ablenstadt snorted, then patted his back pocket. "It's more than you think. I've copied the design of the banknote printing machine, and I also got some special paper for printing banknotes, as well as some developing ink." "Great harvest," the lightning monk complimented. His words were sincere, but his next words were very different. "But you forgot to add a protective spell to this bag. We have to hide in the water now." After that, Oak Fist stretched out his hand, and a blue ripple spread to the bag on the dwarf's back. In this regard, Ablenstadt could only admit that he had indeed left in a hurry and almost ruined the plan. "What about the monster?" "When I sneaked into the slaughterhouse wharf, I found that the surrounding security forces were rushing to a warehouse. It seemed that something big had happened. It's none of our business." The lightning monk ignored him. To be honest, if he had a choice, he probably would not agree to let Tribulation resurrect again. He pulled the dwarf to the beach. "But now, I sincerely hope that they can kill that monster quickly." The two of them jumped directly into the sea and dived into the tin house, where Nam Min was waiting for them. This contract demon that had disguised himself as a pirate of Jorms had a thick stench of blood on his body. It was obvious that he had just experienced an intense battle. "I've cleaned up all the loose ends." Naman glanced at the lightning monk who was casting a priest spell on himself. The wet clothes on the 3 of them were immediately dried. "Now we just need to wait here patiently and pray a little." Regarding this, the other 2 had nothing to object to. "Damn it, that monster is not only fast," Fazak said viciously as he looked at the leopard man who was slaughtering in the crowd and drinking the blood of the duty warriors and the orc wolf riders to heal himself. "He actually has a high-speed healing ability. 12 years ago, this tribulation general died once. At that time, he was going to assassinate the fat mayor of Soft Maple City, but he did not expect to encounter Neru, who was sent by Keys. In the face of the brawny ogre who absolutely crushed him in strength and defense, the leopard man's strength could not be used at all. His blood-sucking ability could not withstand the damage caused by the ogre's heavy punches. But now, when he was facing a group of duty warriors and orc wolf riders, this tribulation general's performance was very different. In terms of strength and speed, the latter 2 were far inferior to him. They could only swing their weapons and often hit the afterimages left by the leopard man. Once the leopard man was injured or weak, he could completely grab an enemy and then restore his body and strength by sucking their blood. Just now, the tribulation general who was hit by the lightning monk's meteorite spell successfully got rid of the trap puppet. A few duty warriors with sabers wanted to go forward and capture the injured leopard man again, but he seized the opportunity and sucked the blood in their bodies dry. In the blink of an eye, this guy became lively again. Fazak led the orc wolf riders to fight with him, using special enchanted short-barreled guns to fire bullets at him. The duty warriors gathered in formation and blocked the leopard man's path as if their lives depended on it. But no matter how hard they tried, this tribulation general was like a slippery loach, always able to find a gap in the crowd. In order to surround this guy, Fazak's security operation team had suffered a lot of casualties. Even if the other 2 operation teams arrived in time, with the addition of the 2 heavy infantry, Goliath and the Grey Dwarves, the encirclement became less and less optimistic. The chieftain of the Goliath clan, Shatterbear Head, frowned. I'm going to charge. Be careful of the shockwave, and pay attention to whether that monster is stunned," he said in a low voice to the gray dwarf husk while maintaining his half-Goliath and half-mammoth combat form. The other party understood his intention and waved his hand to summon a few gray dwarf musketeers. Compared to the enchanted short-barreled guns used by the wolf riders, the long-barreled flintlocks in the gray dwarf's hands were much more accurate. "Moo!" Shatterbearhead raised his head and let out a long roar. This guy had amazing lung capacity, and the roar coming out of his mouth was not only deafening but also endless. The leopard man's mobility was excellent, and it was also because of the exquisite structure of his inner ear. Affected by the broken bear head's roar, his running figure paused for a moment. Seizing the opportunity, Shatterbearhead's four hooves gathered together and rushed toward the Tribulation General. "Got you, kitty meow." Just as he got close to the leopard man, the behemoth raised his two front hooves high and stomped on the ground. 2.5-meter deep craters appeared on the gravel road. It was as if an earthquake had occurred, causing the ground nearby to tremble violently. Damn it! The nearby warriors and orc wolf riders fell down one after another, but the Tribulation General did not have it easy either. He had to leap up and do a forward somersault, trying to avoid the tremors from the ground. "Fire!" Husk kept staring at the leopard man. He and a few gray dwarf musketeers stood far away and were not affected by the shockwave, so their hands were still steady when they fired. Bang, bang, bang. They quickly pulled the trigger 3 times, and 3 rounds of the gray dwarf's flintlock gun whizzed out of the barrel, aiming at the leopard man who could not dodge because he jumped in the air. Puffed, puffed, puffed. The leopard man's colorful fur was very thick, and it was difficult for arrows and crossbows to pierce it. However, the musket bullets were much more powerful than the crossbows. A few musketeers and dozens of bullets finally injured the Tribulation General again. Chapter 800. King's Landing City, Harbor Trade Area. A citywide manhunt took place overnight. It was said that at dawn, the operation team of the Public Security Bureau had already found the location of the robbers and surrounded the slaughterhouse controlled by the Chamber of Commerce. Devil's Stomach Tavern. Gree had just woken up. Last night, in order to deal with 2 drunken customers, he had a fight with those who looked like mercenaries from the south. He looked at himself in the basin. There was a bruise under one eye, and his nose was crooked to one side. He tried to poke it with his finger, and the bruise hurt, and his lower lip seemed to be swollen with blood. However, this did not affect his health. In fact, after experiencing the days of the front line of the blood war, when the organs in his chest and abdomen were all replaced with organs from the underworld, Gree could no longer be considered a normal person. Not only did he have a stomach comparable to a devil's, but he only needed to eat more to quickly recover from the injuries on his body. After washing his face with soap and lathering his chin, Gree took out a sharp knife and shaved his face. He combed his wet hair back and brushed his teeth. Finally, he used warm water to rinse the remaining soap and toothpaste off his face. A beautiful day. He filled the basin with water again and looked at himself in the water. He nodded with satisfaction and said, "It must start with a beautiful breakfast." After that, he walked out of the bedroom and walked down the stairs in his slippers. The tavern would not open until the afternoon. The 2 brothers, One Eye and Crooked Mouth, who acted as workers and were responsible for collecting all kinds of information in the city, had not yet appeared in the tavern hall. Gree had to make breakfast for himself: fried eggs with honey wine and a piece of black bread. Without hesitation, he thought of the breakfast recipe for today. He then picked up a bag of feed made with cuttlefish bones and sunflower seeds and walked to the middle of the tavern where the fire pit was. There was a picky parrot that also needed to eat breakfast. However, when Gree skillfully opened the bag of feed and wanted to pour it into the bird food jar, he suddenly realized that the chain that was used to lock the leg of the king of foul words was now drooping down. The bird rack was empty. The parrot, who was blind in one eye but had a smart tongue, seemed to have broken the chain by itself and flew out of the tavern. Gris couldn't help but frown. Although the strange bird wasn't very likable, Gris still had some feelings for it after taking care of it for 2 or 3 years. Furthermore, It was a gift from Brew, his disciple and the partner behind the Devil's Stomach, to celebrate his 50th birthday. It was obviously inappropriate to lose it just like that. While the half-demon tavern owner was still worrying about where to find the parrot, he had already made at least 3 rounds in King's Landing City last night. He had just experienced a day of losing control. Many travelers and merchants who had come to the Devil's Stomach to spend money had wondered why this one-eyed parrot had such a strong gift for language. Even if it was only in the field of swearing, it was impossible for a normal person to be able to use more than a dozen languages proficiently without long-term training. Not to mention a parrot. The secret was that it wasn't just a parrot. To be more precise, this guy was actually a laboratory product that had undergone many soul surgeries. He was originally called Foolish Opinion. If one had a slightly better memory, one could probably remember that it had only appeared once before being captured 12 years ago. As a general created by the Emperor to bewitch mortals and create chaos, his first mission after being resurrected was unfortunately to encounter a steampunk half-lich with a heart of steel. After going through rounds of torture, the physical body of the one-eyed eagle was destroyed. In order to prevent the Emperor at that time from using magic to recall his soul and then resurrecting it again, Sneyd simply used his soul for experiments. On the feasibility of soul castration surgery, soul elements determining the intelligence of monsters, practical skills of spiritual anatomy, how to split the soul of a one-eyed eagle. He had made a great contribution to Sneyd's academic research work. After the last experiment, although the soul of the one-eyed eagle was much tougher than the soul of an ordinary one-eyed eagle, the soul of Foolish Opinion was still damaged. Well, the last use value was squeezed out. The remaining part of his soul fragment could not be used for other complex experiments, and it would definitely become a defective product if it was made into a soul prism. Therefore, Sneyd simply used it to supplement his previously proven theory with new data. On the feedback effect of the soul on the body, after the experimental data of the soul transfer of hundreds of creatures, a new set of data was added. Tribulation implanted the soul fragment of his Foolish Opinion into the body of a parrot whose soul had been removed. The parrot, which was originally healthy and had excellent eyesight, became a one-eyed parrot. And thanks to the witty tongue spell that was bound to the soul of the one-eyed eagle, this one-eyed parrot had an extraordinary talent for language. However, due to Foolish Opinion's character, its talent was only in the field of swearing and sowing discord. After the experiment was successful, this parrot was supposed to be cleaned up with acid spell. However, it happened to be seen by Brew, who came to the Demolika's laboratory. Brew, who was excited to see the parrot, instantly decided to give this glib-tongued parrot to Mr. Griss as a birthday present. Because he had confirmed that the soul fragment of Foolish Opinion had long been annihilated, Sneyd didn't mind Brew taking the parrot away at all, so he agreed to the ogre's request. In fact, if the accident last night hadn't happened, this parrot would have continued to live as the king of swearing and the tavern mascot until it died of old age. And because the one-eyed eagle had a longer lifespan, it might have lived for more than 100 years. However, last night, the complete recovery of the leopard man triggered a mechanism that the Emperor had buried in the souls of the Foolish Opinion. The one-eyed parrot, which was originally just a product of a soul fragment, quickly recovered the soul fragment that had long been erased. If Sneyd knew about this, he might find that the theory of the omnipotence of the soul that he had previously abandoned had actually been researched by the Emperor. Who am I? Where am I? What am I going to do? After the 3 questions that were necessary to restart wisdom, Foolish Opinion finally figured out his current situation. He decisively used the powerful beak pliers to break the chain tied to his leg and escape from the tavern that he had lived in for several years. Just like the day when he lost control, the Emperor's hidden plan for his rebirth also went out of control. Now he, a semi-finished Foolish Opinion, had to turn the tide. Chapter 801. Nowadays, Eugene flew over a factory that was burning in flames. He had just cast a spiritual body spell, turned into an incorporeal form, and dived into the ground to pick up a broken bone. The better the equipment, the faster you die. Flying over the high walls of the factory area of King's Descent City, he faced the morning sun and bathed in the morning light. He quickly headed toward the location he sensed. Because he was no longer the strong Cyclops, he could not use spells frequently. Fortunately, he still had wings. In the harbor trade area of King's Descent City, the bazaars and markets did not open for the morning market, which was rare. Their managers had all received a notice from the security bureau. Before the arrival of the next security order, all the markets in this magnificent city must remain closed. Leopard Man, you must hold on, Eugene encouraged his companion, who was also a tribulation general, in his heart. He was now racing against time. He really did not want the plan to go to the end, only to end up with nothing. If that was really the case, he would have to start the backup plan. And the backup plan itself meant that he would have to bear all the pain himself. Thinking of this, even though he was only a colorful parrot now, Eugene behaved like a hawk, flapping his wings fiercely and tumbling in the air. He quickly came to the slaughtering dock and heard a series of firecrackers exploding in the sky. Leopard Man, who jumped into the air to avoid being hit by the shockwave, was hit by a few bullets. Then, with a fierce force, he crashed to the ground like a statue that was pushed down. Tribulation squeezed his tight teeth together, making a crunching sound. His muscles twisted and pulled, and earthworm-like lines bulged on the surface of his skin. "We hit him!" Excited shouts came from the ground. Several duty warriors took a net woven together with cow tendons and thick hemp rope and threw it at Leopard Man. The behemoth broken bare head stomped on the ground with its 4 hooves, jumped up, and stomped on Tribulation General. Absolutely not. Eugene's eyes were about to burst. He could not let Leopard Man die. At least, he could not let him die here. Forcibly squeezing out the power that belonged to the Cyclops in his body, his blind eyes, which were covered with white clouds, revealed a pale green light. Powerful activated object. Within a radius of several dozen yards, many things came to life, including a warehouse on the street used to store whale bones and all the whalebone products stored inside. At this moment, Panther Guy was dragging a bunch of nets and desperately dodging the trampling of the shattered bear's head. He was charging through a group of orc wolf riders and was getting closer and closer to the warehouse that had been activated. Originally, he wanted to rush into the warehouse to untie himself and then use the terrain to escape. But who would have thought that the animated whalebone products warehouse would directly swallow him? Under the effect of the powerful animate object spell, the whalebones, wooden boards, and brick walls in the warehouse fused together, twisting and integrating into a breathtaking giant monster. It lifted its toes, which were made of oak, and crawled out from its original position on the compacted road, leaving only a deep hole. It opened its mouth and spat out a tongue made of wooden planks with whalebone barbs embedded in it. Leopard Man was just wrapped in this tongue and fell into its stomach. The 3 captains of the King's Descent Security Bureau were stunned. They never thought that the operation to encircle and capture the robber would gradually evolve into dealing with such a monster. Looking at the animated warehouse that was even more exaggerated than his size, Shattered Bear's head clenched the steam hammer in his hand and thought to himself, "Should we transfer a few hell roars over?" In fact, his idea was correct, but it was a little too late. The animated warehouse was the first to attack. It shook its head, and the bricks squeezed against the wood and made a cracking sound. The iron roof covering its back was instantly torn apart and then shot out in all directions. At the same time, the blubber barrels that were originally stored in the warehouse were spat out one after another from its mouth. The members of the security operation team had to use shields and obstacles to avoid the iron blades that were like flying knives, and they also had to be careful of their feet. Because the sticky blubber covered the entire street, it was as if a mage had cast a large-scale grease spell here. The Grey Dwarf supervisor was the first to react. "Don't use firearms. Everyone retreat and keep a distance." However, his warning was still a little too late. A few Grey Dwarf musketeers and duty warriors had already aimed at the animated warehouse and pulled the trigger. The bullets hit the animated warehouse's body and only broke a few bricks, but the sparks that burst out from the gunpowder ignited the blubber covering the ground. The blubber was a semi-finished product that had been specially processed and was prepared to be used to make whale oil candles. With just a few sparks, the blubber suddenly burst into a light blue flame. What was even more terrifying was that many of the security operation team's armor were stained with blubber. They desperately retreated while looking for something to pat the flames that ignited on their bodies. The originally tight encirclement formation instantly collapsed into a pile of loose sand. Activating the warehouse shook its head, as if it was mocking these losers who couldn't withstand a single blow. Its face was all open, and the warehouse door that acted as its mouth directly flipped open on both sides. Like a frog preying on insects, the barbed tongue with whale bones repeatedly stuck out, rolled up the unlucky ones who ran too slow, and threw them into its bloody mouth. Even Broken Bear was unfortunately caught. Although this half-Gorian, half-mastodon leviathan creature was huge in size, it was finally dragged into the mouth of the animated warehouse and stuffed into its abdomen bit by bit. Its abdomen was like a hell of needles. The whale bones and broken wooden thorns kept stirring, stabbing, squeezing, and grinding all the creatures that entered, except for Leopard Man. Not only did Tribulation avoid all the torture, but the thorns also helped him break the thick rope net on his body, allowing him to regain his freedom in the belly of the animated warehouse. Using the same trick, Leopard Man caught two members of the operation team who were close to him and drank a mouthful of blood to restore his strength and heal his wounds. Then he turned his gaze to Broken Bear Head, who was wielding a steam giant hammer and fighting against the animated warehouse's stomach sack. Tribulation licked his lips, lowered his body, and prepared to launch a fatal sneak attack on the captain of the security operation team, who had almost trampled him to death. However, a sudden voice interrupted his rhythm. "Idiot, don't waste time here." Foolish opinion fell on Leopard Man. The blind parrot cursed. "I spent so much effort to save you. Why don't you run away, you idiot? Are you dreaming?" Leopard Man narrowed his eyes. "Foolish opinion? Don't talk nonsense. We'll talk later. The Emperor still needs you and me to resurrect." Foolish opinion directly projected an escape route that he had investigated when he came here into Leopard Man's mind with magic. Chapter 802. Wolf Run, Boar Rush. Leopard Man ran at full speed. Yu Jin flew in the air and constantly corrected their route. They divided the work closely and were amazingly efficient. Soon, they broke free from the security team's encirclement. The warehouse of whalebone products that had been activated turned into ruins the moment the spell effect ended. Broken Bear Head, who was covered in wounds, stepped on the bricks and rubble and let out a furious roar in the midst of the collapse. The half-Goliath, half-Mammoth, who had lost control of his emotions, moved his forehooves and rushed straight to the rows of warehouses belonging to the Chamber of Commerce. He swung the steam giant hammer and turned into a heavy bulldozer fueled by anger. After a long while, the powerful warrior finally calmed down. As a price, almost half of the buildings in the entire slaughterhouse wharf were turned into ruins. There was no point in trying to repair it. When a messenger carrying an electromagnetic communicator reported the latest information from the Security Bureau to Fazak, Smash Bear leader, and Husk, the other half of the building was quickly destroyed. A diversion. Husk had a pipe in his mouth, and the choking smoke lingered around him. Although he did not act as directly as Broken Bear Head, the Gray Dwarf supervisor's veins were already bulging. Unfortunately, the banknote printing factory that was involved in the accident was located within its administrative jurisdiction. According to the rules of the Scales of Eternal Order, he must be jointly responsible for the fire, theft, and deliberate destruction of the factory. Durag's beard stubble. Husk lamented in his heart. The treatment of the Scales of Eternal Order was considered generous in the entire multiverse, but the various rules and regulations were also notoriously strict. As an old man who had experienced the bloody front line, the Gray Dwarf knew that escaping was useless, and he did not even want to think about escaping. The only thing he hoped for now was that the punishment would not affect his family and people. After the battle, The injured and the dead were sent to the medical camp. The three operation captains lined up and walked into the office at the top of the security bureau. Brock was waiting for their summary of the operation. "I'm sorry." The desert elf's face was wearing a sound spell booster, so his voice was always dull and hoarse. "From last night until this morning, we've been out of control." Smash Barehead had already returned to his Goliath form. The brawny man leaned on his steam hammer, looking sullen. Fazak squatted on the carpet and stared at the ground, not saying a word. As for Husk, the 300-year-old supervisor, he was like a 13-year-old child waiting to be scolded by his teacher. He tucked his helmet under his arm and waited with his head bowed. "In fact, this operation was terrible," Brock said in a deep voice. "Other than capturing the representative of the Reliance Wind Chamber of Commerce, we didn't accomplish anything. Not only did they let Leopard Man escape, but such an important place like the banknote printing factory was also attacked. Furthermore," he paused, "according to the latest information, 2 more monsters have escaped from King's Landing City. They are Leopard Man's accomplices. One of them is Foolish Opinion, which was weakened. He was the one who destroyed your operation at the last moment. The other one is suspected to be Soul Search. The shadow niche that stored Leopard Man's bones in the place of Chongshan was broken, and a part of her remains is missing." Hearing this, the 3 operation captains raised their heads at the same time and widened their eyes. They already knew that the consequences of this failed operation would be severe, but they didn't expect it to be so severe. "But this failure can't be entirely blamed on you." Brock's words were like music to their ears, especially to Husk. "Now, all of you have to be alert and maintain the order of King's Landing City today. If anyone dares to try to pull chestnuts out of the fire, then let them know the ruthlessness of the Security Bureau." Finishing his words, the desert elf waved his hand. It meant that the meeting was adjourned and the 3 of them could leave. The rest is not something you can participate in. Brock looked at the documents on the information board and secretly added in his heart. 3 days later, King's Landing City Harbor Trade Area. Those merchants who had finished their business in the morning and afternoon markets and didn't want to spend the effort to check the authenticity of banknotes in the night market would mostly choose to find a familiar place to rest for a while and have a drink. Because of the superior location and moderate price of food and drinks, Griss's Devil's Stomach Tavern became bustling in the afternoon. Travelers and merchants from all over Ramsey enjoyed the fine wine and delicacies while chatting and bragging. Inadvertently, they would reveal a lot of gossip that was circulating in the marketplace. "Have you heard? A drinker drank a few cups of honey wine and boasted with a flushed face to his drinking buddies. The mayor of Red Pine City came to King's Landing personally 2 days ago. He even found Green of Emerald Wood City to accompany him. He wants to save a knight of his city." "Which knight has such great influence?" "Of course not, but his only son is different." The drinker looked around and whispered in what he thought was a small voice. "It is said that Sir Aegon, who was arrested by the police, is the illegitimate son of the mayor of Red Pine City." "There seems to be such a rumor," someone agreed. "The mayor of Red Pine City has 3 daughters, but no son. He loves Sir Aegon very much, but he didn't betroth any of his daughters to him. That Aegon is riding on the coattails of the Chamber of Commerce." Another person joined the conversation. "He's a noble, but he actually became a son-in-law of a merchant family." Several people sneered in disdain. More than a decade ago, the nobles of Ramsey looked down on merchants and wouldn't take the initiative to claim kinship with a merchant family. But when the emperor woke up and the monsters abused him for a few years, the atmosphere of the Ramsey continent changed. In the northern region, due to the construction of King's Landing City, commerce and trade flourished. The scale of perpetual order was the highest authority here, and any noble who dared to challenge it was turned into powder. In the southern region, during the years when the monsters wreaked havoc, many merchants moved their businesses there. With the wealth in their hands, they monopolized the lifeline industries of many cities and became rising nobles. Therefore, in the current Ramsey, the status of merchants greatly increased. The nobles who originally occupied the land had to deal with the merchants they originally looked down on in order to continue living a life of luxury. The most common way to deal with them was through marriage. But nobles like Sir Aegon, who directly became a son-in-law of a merchant family in order to ride on the coattails of the Chamber of Commerce, were indeed rare. Chapter 803. Green Inn. King's Landing did not have an embassy, but the scale of perpetual order allowed Ramsay to build high-class inns in other cities. These inns could be open to the public, but when important people came to King's Landing, they would be used as embassies. Red Pine City's mayor, Vlad, and Emeraldwood City's mayor, Green, came to King's Landing, so they naturally stayed in the Green family's high-class inn. Fred was sitting in the hall of the inn, sipping tea that had just been served. He was waiting for Green's news. "What's the situation?" Looking at Green walking down the stairs, the old man in his 60s asked. "Aegon won't die for the time being," Green said. There was another silence. Since entering King's Landing, Fred, who was hale and hearty and eloquent, would often fall into an awkward silence. But Green knew that this old man would not be confused by a sudden attack. He was a warrior through and through. Seeing the two mayors chatting, several attendants retreated from the light brown marble floor of the hall. They also closed the side doors of the hall, putting down the bone china cup of tea. Because he had barbecued meat pie for breakfast, according to Fred's habit, he would drink some of this drink to get rid of the greasy feeling. "Although I don't want to admit it, and I won't admit it, Aegon is indeed my only son." This time, it was Green who remained silent. Even if he had a good relationship with the mayor of Red Pine City, but as the mayor of another city and one of the few great nobles in Ramsay, he had received etiquette education since childhood, so he could not say anything about the issue of illegitimate children. "Aegon is a good boy," Fred continued. "Although he has no talent, according to the rules I set, he is more than qualified to be the next mayor of Red Pine City. But he is not the mayor yet." Green keenly noticed something. According to the King's Landing Convention, only the current mayor of each city has a certain degree of diplomatic immunity. Fred naturally knew this as well, so he nodded. "I don't want to offend him, but at the same time," after a pause, the mayor of Red Pine City continued, "I know it is difficult for you and me to disobey the colossus that is the scale of perpetual order. After all, the prosperity of our respective cities in recent years has been due to the extensive trade cooperation with King's Landing City." Then, he changed the topic, "But the problem is that the matter at the Slaughterhouse Wharf is actually the responsibility of the Exine Phone Chamber of Commerce. Aegon just happened to be the trade representative of the Chamber of Commerce. Before him, there were two other trade representatives who came to Junlin City. I don't believe that those two fellows with the surname Trade Wind are innocent. Aegon just picked up the mess they left behind." "You have a point. But if the scales of eternal order agrees with your point of view, what will they get?" Green knew that Fred was lying. Although the previous two trade representatives of the Chamber of Commerce were not clean, most of them were not like Aegon, who evaded taxes and smuggled contraband. Otherwise, with the nature of the scales of eternal order, those two would definitely not have survived until he stepped down. Paying back the taxes and fines is a must. Green sighed. Fred had indeed supported him during the years when the monsters were wreaking havoc. Now that something had happened to him, Green could not stay out of it. But if you want to save Aegon's life, you have to pay something that the scales of eternal order will take a fancy to. Believe me, old friend, those things are incomparably expensive, even more valuable than our lives. Obviously, Fred understood Green's words. The old man's imposing manner was instantly stifled. However, he immediately revealed a sly smile. Red Pine City cannot be given to them, not even thinking about it. But he looked at the several doors on both sides of the hall. Those thick oak doors and the olive-colored leather wrapped around them made him regain his confidence. "I still have a price that will definitely satisfy Mr. Keys of the Scales of Eternal Order. But the premise is that you can arrange a meeting for me. Otherwise, there will be no way to quote a price, and that generous gift will be meaningless." We weigh anchor today. Naaman stared at the two people in front of him. The pale blue light emitted by the blubber candle shrouded his eyes in a layer of strange color, appearing cold and strange. He did not say set off or set off. In order to disguise himself as a descendant of the Joms pirates, he used weigh anchor, a word that few people in Ramsey would use. But Oak Fist and Ablostad did not object. In fact, Naaman was being overly cautious. After staying in the stifling underwater tin hut for 3 days, the lightning monk and the dwarf investigator had long been anxious in their hearts. At this time, they were eager to return to the surface and breathe in a breath of fresh and dry air. At noon, weigh anchor on time, Naaman explained. The patrol boats that are really driving away the Sawajan and mad sharks will go out to sea at this time, so that they can reach the working area in the evening. After a busy night, we will return to King's Landing City the next morning. After that, he opened the wrought tan suitcase that he carried with him and took out 2 sleeveless linen shirts. These are often worn by people who go out to sea. I'll take one, you too. I'll take it. Oak Fist took the clothes, took off the robe on his body, and quickly put them on. Ablostad cursed in a low voice, but his camouflage exoskeleton could not be covered by the linen shirt. So although the dwarf investigator was very reluctant, he still had to stay in the underwater tin hut. After changing the clothes, Naaman carried the suitcase and jumped into the middle of the room, followed by Oak Fist. The two quickly floated to the surface, grabbed the edge of the patrol boat, and flipped over. Naaman opened the wrought tan suitcase again. This time, he took out a very high-end cosmetic box, the kind that only the noble ladies of the major families would be willing to buy. With the disguised skill of the contract demon, he skillfully changed his and Oak Fist's faces, and the two instantly looked like they had been working at sea all year round. Bronze skin, deep wrinkles caused by salt stains on the face, and mottled burn marks that seemed to be caused by friction with ropes for a long time on the palms of Naaman's hands. After finishing these preparations, he skillfully untied the ropes wrapped around the anchorage and raised the sail in the middle of the double-hulled boat. The lightning monk, who was not familiar with the work on the boat, was arranged to be next to the wheel. The hydrology of King's Landing Harbor is very good. As long as you don't turn the wheel into a top, you can sail out by following the beacon. Remember, no matter what, do not leave the wheel, especially when leaving the harbor for inspection. Although your appearance is very much like a person who has been living at sea all year round, as long as you look at the way you walk on the boat, even the best disguise will be exposed. Chapter 804. The storm came suddenly, and the sea slammed violently against the patrol boat that had just left the port a few hourglasses ago. The weather quickly evolved into one of the most intense storms Oak Fist had ever seen. Lightning flashed, thunder rumbled, rain poured, and the sea surged. Naaman walked back and forth on the catamaran. Sometimes he loosened the ropes on the mainmast. Sometimes he stepped over the rope net to balance the hull with his weight. Another huge wave hit, and the boat was thrown into the air and fell heavily in the trough of the wave. Those who had never sailed could not imagine what it felt like to be hit by the sea like rocks. At this moment, the entire boat was shaking and the hull creaked horribly. "What do you mean?" "Fortunately, you took a catamaran." Lightning Monk, who fixed himself to the rudder, secretly complained. He felt that Naaman's words were too optimistic. He looked at Naaman, who was firmly holding on to the rope net and swinging slightly with the boat. He suspected that the other party would fall into the sea with a scream when the next wave came crashing over. "Please don't," Oak Fist prayed, because he knew that without Naaman, he alone could not control the small boat in the wind and rain. Naaman was thrown high into the air by the force of the huge wave with a battle cry of the pirates of Jorms. But just as Oak Fist was about to use magic to rescue the captain, he nimbly climbed onto the beam of the mainmast. Naaman nimbly untied the buckle and let the cable through the pulley block bring him and the mainsail down together. He quickly put away the mainsail and gestured to Oak Fist. Lightning Monk thought he was saying small scene. After working for more than half an hour, the storm gradually subsided. Although they could still feel the bumps, the catamaran was not in danger of capsizing for the time being. Nauman sat on the deck, which was rare. Didn't you say that King's Landing's hydrology is excellent? At some point, Oak Fist found a bottle of rum in the cabin and handed it to Nauman, who was sitting and resting. Because we deviated from the course. Nauman explained simply, sailing at sea is the same as on land. It is naturally much safer to walk on a fixed waterway. Now that we've deviated from our course, the waves we've encountered just now are nothing. Okay, I seem to have forgotten something. Oak Fist picked up a piece of jerky, not caring that it was wet from the seawater. He chewed it up and swallowed it into his stomach. The dwarf investigator, who had been forgotten by Roland in the tin house under the water, was already rumbling with hunger. After leaving the stormy area, the patrol boat once again raised its sails. The fierce west wind gave the boat a strong impetus. The parallel hull cut across the surface of the water like two sharp blades, tearing out two white waves on the surface of the sea. They had sailed for a good 3 hourglasses. The night was heavy. Narman did not use the navigation compass on the small boat. Instead, he used the old method passed down by the pirates of Jorms, which was to use the stars to determine their position and constantly calibrate their course. When the sun rose and the pink rays of the sun shone on the surface of the sea, they finally saw a ship anchored. When the lightning monk first discovered it, the ship was only the size of a fist. When the small boat got closer, the ship had already become a huge monster. The small boat was originally designed to roam the inner sea, so it was completely covered by the shadow of the large ship. Only the main mast was slightly higher than the side of the ship. When the two boats got closer, more than 10 long hooked poles immediately extended from the side of the large ship. More than 10 burly men, who looked like they were pirates of Jorms like Narman, were shirtless. They worked hard to pull the patrol boat over bit by bit, while at the same time carefully ensuring that it did not collide with the large ship. Narman and Oak Fist quickly boarded the ship using a rope ladder thrown down from the side of the ship. When the first mate, who was directing the work on the deck, saw this, he immediately ran over with a triangular hat in his hand. "Captain, you've worked hard. Prepare 2 sets of clean clothes for this gentleman and me." "No, prepare 3 sets. Narman nodded to the first mate and gave a few orders. The first mate immediately ran across the deck and went to the captain's cabin at the stern to complete the captain's orders. Narman did not care about the surprised lightning monk. He walked directly to the side of the ship, grabbed a rope, and stepped onto the side of the ship. Put in more effort, clamped the winch on the main mast, then send 2 men into the water to wrap the rope around the container at the bottom of the water. As soon as he gave the order, 2 sailors immediately jumped off the ship. Both of them had ropes wrapped around their bodies. It was obvious that this was not the first time they were ordered to do this, so they were very skillful. Not long after, the iron house that had been hidden under the small boat was fished out of the sea by the sailors using winches and ropes. Everyone worked together to move the container and the goods hidden inside all onto the deck. Fortunately, I didn't disappoint you. Narman, who had released Ablenstadt for the claustrophobic iron house and changed into clean clothes, greeted him. At the same time, he said indifferently, "Let's go to the restaurant to talk? While we're at it, let's settle the final payment for this transportation." Many sailors armed with crossbows and swords gathered around. Their actions made Narman's words more convincing. Oak Fist supported Ablenstadt, who had just been cleaned by Oak Fist with a mystical spell. Although the iron house under the water was slightly better than the small boat on the sea during the storm, it was not much more stable. The dwarf investigator vomited a few times. Oak Fist and Ablenstadt hadn't expected this to happen. They didn't expect that Nam Min, the grave robber, would be the captain of the ship he spoke of. But since they had already boarded the pirate ship, they did not want to carry the broken wooden planks, the loot from King's Landing City, and rely on luck to drift to Dwarf Island after making a big fuss. Therefore, the 2 men did not resist and followed Narman's guidance to walk down the deck. According to Ramsey's ship layout, the first floor below the deck was the crew's restaurant. When important decisions needed to be made, The captain could also hold a meeting here to discuss matters with the crew. Do you know the reason why I took that order? Lightning Monk and the dwarf investigator knew what he was referring to. Is actually to make up for the deficit. Digging is just a hobby of mine. Running the sea is the real business of the Pirates of Jorms. I originally had 2 ships. The ship transported 50 loads of spices from King's Landing City, plus more than 300 barrels of rum. But who would have thought that one of my men would have an accident? The barrel broke, the rum burned, and the spices soaked in water. After that, I made sure that the guy had an accident and then buried him while he was still breathing. Naaman was munching on a grilled seabird and drinking rum. He was already drunk, and his nose and face were as red as peaches. The sailors around him looked at their captain in awe. So, you understand my rules? Naaman raised his eyebrows at Oak Fist. I had a hard time digging that thing out of the ground, and I also lost a private dock that could be accessed and a few employees who looked after the place there. That catamaran also has to be abandoned. It can't be hung at the back of our ship, the first mate reminded. That's right, Naaman nodded. He made a 4 gesture with his fingers and then extended his palm to the Lightning Monk and the dwarf investigator who were eating oatmeal. Previously, I said I would get double the reward. Now, I have to ask for 4 times the reward to make up for my loss. Chapter 805. We are going to Red Pine City's West Sea town. The Lightning Monk and the dwarf said to Naaman, "Your ship cannot sail directly to Dwarf Island, or else it might be targeted by the mages in King's Landing City." Naaman had no objections to this. The ships that were authorized to sail to Dwarf Island were the ships of their merchant association. For example, if this Jom's pirate ship approached the island, not to mention whether it would be sunk, just appearing near the island would be too conspicuous. They were currently in the northern part of the Ramsey continent, and the journey to Red Pine City on the western coast was not too far. Furthermore, West Sea Town was an important trading port in that area. Although there were not as many merchant groups and ships going from the south to the north as there were in King's Landing City, there were still quite a few. Therefore, this ship could safely sail on the sea route with a little disguise. In less than 2 days, they had sailed into the port of West Sea Town. After paying the berth fee, Naaman also paid a tax because the ship had some rum and spices as a disguise. Of course, this was paid by the Lightning Monk and the dwarf. At the very least, they had to pretend to be polite with Naaman before they could contact the other Lightning Monks hiding here and load the goods onto the cargo ship that the Chamber of Commerce regularly sailed to Dwarf Island. Furthermore, before their colleagues on Dwarf Island received the goods, they could not fall out with them. Oak Fist and Ablenstadt had a vague feeling that the Jom's pirates might dare to rob the Chamber of Commerce's ships. When they came ashore, it was the triennial accounting day. The trade representatives of the Chamber of Commerce would bring the accounting books back to the headquarters of the Chamber of Commerce in West Sea Town. The coastal town became very lively. Oak Fist sat in the spacious stone room of the tavern, surrounded by revelers who were drinking and singing. They would occasionally shout and dance, clap, and make a din. The drummer played a new rhythm. The drumbeat made him tremble, like a quartet hammered out by a beating heart, pumping out invisible blood and making the entire room more lively. The huge brazier roasted him, and also cast a gorgeous light on the revelers, causing beads of sweat to appear on their faces. There were some people who couldn't stand this kind of revelry and fell to the ground with flushed faces, proving that their stomachs were inferior wine sacks. The drunkard looked no different from a dead person until he was carried out of the banquet hall by his friends and placed on the bed prepared in advance. Only then did he show some signs of life. How much longer do we have to wait? The dwarf investigator sitting next to him glanced at him, then sipped the honey cider in the corner glass. The cider would flow through a tube into the dwarf's mouth in the exoskeleton disguise. "We'll wait until they come back," Oak Fist replied. "The Lightning Monk here has already contacted the Truin Merchant Guild ship, but I don't want to drift on the sea with a group of people I've never met before for 5 or 6 days." Ablenstadt agreed with this statement. "The mercenaries under my command have already withdrawn from King's Landing. They will board the ship with us and protect us and the goods that we have painstakingly obtained. They will accompany us to Dwarf Island. Ablandstat controlled the kinetic skeleton to put a barbecue pie into the robe. We'll do as you say. After all, it was indeed reassuring to have his own people by his side. Also, before we leave, do we need to? The exoskeleton slightly waved its hand and lightly tapped the table with its palm. I think we can let the True Wind Merchant Guild do it. Oak Fist completely understood the intention of his companion, but he still made his own suggestion. But we can't say it out loud, so we have to think of a reason that makes sense. Do you think it's okay to tell them that a group of Jorm's pirates sneaked into West Seatown? The dwarf investigator ate, but he still controlled the exoskeleton to make an O shape with his palm, which meant that he thought Oak Fist's idea was not bad. They all knew that the line between sea carriage drivers like the True Wind Merchant Guild and pirates was actually very blurry. They had cameos many times, but even if they were really pirates, they would not tolerate another group of competitors stepping into their territory. The door of the tavern was pushed open, and a few travel-worn people squeezed into the noisy paradise. Oak Fist saw his deputy at a glance. If Nauman was here, he would probably also recognize that person as the guy barbecuing meat behind the sandbank. Those people walked directly to the fire pit and pushed away the drinkers who were chatting and warming themselves by the fire. Seeing that these people were wearing weapons, the drinkers did not dare to say anything and left with their tails between their legs. "How's the situation?" Oak Fist vaguely made a gesture. Under the effect of a priest's spell, his voice, which was as soft as a mosquito's buzz, accurately reached his deputy's ears. Not bad. The deputy focused on warming his hands by the fire pit, and a mercenary group member went to the bar to buy food and drinks for them. The leaders of Greenwood and Red Pine have all gone to King's Landing. I don't know if they will reach any agreement, but the True Wind Merchant Guild hasn't made any moves yet. The market day will still be held as usual. I think it's a bit strange. Ablandstat glanced at his companion, who had just been linked to the conversation. Dwarf Island is the main customer and supplier of True Wind, but so is King's Landing. The loyalty of those people is only average, so we can't trust them too much. So we have to find something for them to do. Something happened to the foreign trade representative in King's Landing. Although it's serious, they still haven't lost hope. Oak Fist decisively decided, we have to let them know that the pirates of Jomu who have appeared in their territory are grave robbers. When the time comes, they will most likely choose to quietly bury this matter. That will only backfire, the dwarf investigator sneered, and then said seriously, the spies of King's Landing are everywhere. Their wishful thinking is a provocation in the eyes of the scale of perpetual order. A trade war will definitely break out between the two merchant guilds, and it may even escalate into a military action. Of course, at that time, True Wind will soon disappear. If the rise of King's Landing had brought pressure to all the cities on the Ramsey continent, then the powerful scale of perpetual order was the nightmare of all the Ramsey merchant guilds. Because they could not resist, they could only accept a series of rules set by the other party. But this did not mean that the merchant guilds had given up their hostility. They just hid it well under their daily business. If the scale of perpetual order sent troops to destroy the True Wind Merchant Guild, the other Ramsey merchant guilds would most likely mourn. Then, they would probably do many irrational things, and some disputes would arise. And war was the ultimate solution to all disputes. As a Ramseyan, Oak Fist did not want to reignite the flames of war on this land, but he had another identity. As a servant of the god of virtual games, Stim, he also had the responsibility of spreading the glory of the god. So he wanted to get rid of the scale of perpetual order, which used various indirect means to prevent the god from building a temple in King's Landing. Chapter 806. Their clothes, red and black striped pants, dark blue jumpers, and a three-cornered hat of the same color as their clothes, were all of high quality, but the style was a bit old. This meant tradition. As the trade representatives of the Chamber of Commerce, on the sacred inventory day, they would meticulously put on the uniform that the master of the Chamber of Commerce had given them. They came from all corners of the Ramsey continent. Many people's appearance and living habits had long been influenced by the cities they had been stationed in for a long time. Some had beards, some didn't. Some had dyes on their faces, and some had tattoos, but the uniform made these trade representatives look like a whole. They were all loyal servants of the master of the Chamber of Commerce. Welcome back to our home. The current master of the Chamber of Commerce was a young man in his 20s. His name was Sangar, which came from his grandfather. It meant pioneer. 7 years ago, when Sangar had just turned 15 years old, he had killed his father's right-hand man who had controlled the Chamber of Commerce for a long time, the master of the Chamber of Commerce, who was also known as the Knight of the Chamber of Commerce. At the same time, in order to establish a foothold in West Sea Town, Sangar not only married the only daughter of the original mayor, Algert, but also married several of his sisters to some nearby nobles with real power. With the help of these relatives, the young master of the Chamber of Commerce quickly opened the business of the Chamber of Commerce on the fast track, and also extended the tentacles of the Chamber of Commerce to the entire Ramsey continent. West Sea Town was only a small town. It was originally insignificant in the sphere of influence of Red Pine City, but because of the headquarters of the Chamber of Commerce, it had now become the most prosperous place in the entire Red Pine City. Sangar personally poured a cup of honey wine for all the trade representatives. For the never-ending trade winds, he raised his wine cup and said, "As long as the trade winds don't stop, my profits will never stop." A total of 12 trade representatives drank the contents of their cups together. They found that there was still a wine cup on the silver plate carried by the servant behind Sangar. One of the trade representatives didn't show up on time on the inventory day. What was going on? One of our friends didn't make it back in time. The representative of Aegon was trapped in King's Landing, Sangar said calmly. It was as if he was talking about a stranger and not his brother-in-law who was related to him by blood. However, these trade representatives did not pay attention to Sangar's tone. They were more concerned about the content of the patriarch's words. In the past 5 years, the business that provided the most profit for the Chamber of Commerce had changed. Not only was King's Descent City the center of the Chamber of Commerce's whale blubber industry, it was also the Chamber of Commerce's largest treasury. Only when the trade there operated normally could the Chamber of Commerce obtain an endless stream of real banknotes to maintain the various businesses that they had developed in other cities. Since the year of the monster's rampage, the commercial system of the Ramsey continent had undergone many changes. The most important point was that the known gem coin, which was once the backbone of the payment system, was gradually replaced by the real banknotes issued by the scale of perpetual order in King's Landing City. Although this did not mean that gemstone coins had become worthless, in the era when goods produced by various factories in King's Landing City were dumped on the Ramsey continent, the actual purchasing power of gemstone coins was indeed inferior to that of real money. Now, even some of the goods produced on Dwarf Island would be traded with real banknotes. This was to facilitate the purchase of goods produced in King's Landing City in the future. Honorable Patriarch, a short, dark-skinned trade representative with thick lips and a mustache, broke the silence in the meeting room. What should we do next? What I mean is, should we communicate with the scale of perpetual order and then select a suitable trade representative to regroup in King's Landing City? The trade representative's words did not mention anything about Aegon. There was no mention of the rescue of Aegon, which was cold and heartless. However, Sangar cast an expectant look at him. You are right. We cannot give up on our interests in King's Landing City. Then what about Sir Aegon? A trade representative who was not very good at reading expressions suddenly questioned. However, given that the trade area he was in charge of was in Red Pine City, and that this person had a good relationship with the mayor of Red Pine City, Fred, his question was reasonable. People need to take responsibility for the things they have done. Sangar glanced at him and said indifferently. The attitude of the patriarch of the Trustwind Merchant Guild very well expressed his decision on how to deal with this matter. At this moment, 2 attendants suddenly ran into the meeting room. Because of the bells hanging from their bodies, Sangar and the rest knew of their arrival, even from a distance. Master! The 2 attendants called out in unison at the same time. They immediately knelt on the ground. each of them holding a letter in their hands and respectfully raising it above their heads, waiting for Sangar to read it. The two letters were sealed with wax, a characteristic of the Trustwind Merchant Guild's secret letters. Sangar tore open the wax, took out the parchment inside, and quickly read through it. All the trade representatives present noticed that the patriarch of the Trustwind Merchant Guild's face had turned ashen after he finished reading the two letters. Ridiculous! He passed a letter to the trade representatives present. It was a letter from the Dwarf Island, asking the Trustwind Merchant Guild to compensate for the goods they had stored at King's Landing City's Slaughterhouse Wharf. The transaction has already been completed, and the goods have been inspected and taken over. Now, they want us to compensate for the losses. Sangar did not hide his anger. Moreover, those goods are contraband. It was Aegon who took the initiative to provide them for the dwarves. How dare they ask for compensation from us? They are the ones who caused the losses to the Trustwind Merchant Guild. The trade representatives did not know the whole story. However, when Sangar said that the contraband was provided by Aegon on his own initiative, they did not believe him. However, no one was willing to point this out, especially when they knew that even if Sangar was angry, he would most likely agree to the conditions proposed by the dwarves. The reason was simple. The Trustwind Merchant Guild could not risk offending another important trading partner when their relationship with King's Landing City was in danger. If that was the case, Sangar might as well change his name to digging his own grave. As for the other letter, Sangar did not hand it over to the trade representatives present. He walked to the table in the meeting room, took out a feather brush, and wrote a few lines on it. Then, he sealed it with wax and handed it to the waiting attendant. Return this letter. Chapter 807. The red sun lit up the horizon like the brightest piece of coal in the blacksmith's forge. It licked the edge of the burning clouds and scattered a circle of color, like an unintentional graffiti on a canvas. Since they arrived at West Seatown yesterday, Naman hadn't gotten off the ship. The Jom's crew he recruited went ashore in batches to rest. They went to the taverns to drink and chatted with the ladies on the street. After all, those people were Jom's pirates, and Naman didn't have the intention to restrict their actions. They really think I'm a Jom's pirate. Naman sipped his yogurt in a tin cup and looked at a magic map on the table in boredom. It was a magical item that could project the vision of a few detection magic eyes onto the map. Now, Naman saw many armored soldiers appear out of thin air near the port anchorage. Those people all had short spears in their hands. There were 2 leather scabbards on the spears with 2 daggers in them. Their clothes were all black, and they looked more like mercenaries than guards. Among these people, the leader was a young man in his 20s. He had the typical brown hair of a Ramsey human. It was curled and fell to his shoulders. There was a white rope buckle on his waistcoat. It was the symbol of the captain of the Reliance Wind Merchant Guild. In fact, it wasn't just Naman who was holding the magic map. Before this group of people walked into the harbor, many merchants who anchored their ships here noticed them. Some of the merchants were anxious because they didn't pay enough taxes. Some were calm. They were definitely honest merchants. But most of the people wisely chose to stay on the ships when they saw the armed team. They didn't dare to do anything rash. Of course, most of the people didn't include Naman. Be careful. Pick up your weapons. We have guests to entertain. Naman picked up the microphone on the table and yelled at the top of his lungs. His voice was transmitted through the copper pipes and echoed through the loudspeakers in the cabins. Other than those who were still having fun in West Seatown, all the Jom's pirates heard the captain's warning. The battle zeal that was rooted in their blood began to take effect. The Yomians immediately left the hammocks, dining tables, and benches in front of the workbench and ran to the storage room where the weapons and equipment were stored. The first mate was there to distribute various weapons to them. There were only a dozen or so weapons that could be used to equip the 30 or so Jom's pirates. Muskets with half of their caps missing, flintlocks with rivets on their shafts, ballistas without lubrication, scimitars, shields, oars, short spears, armor-piercing hammers, and so on. However, in order to disguise themselves better, Naman had purchased a batch of half-body plate armor for these people. Those are the newest designs from King's Landing City this year. In order to protect them from being corroded by the salty sea, the first mate had to constantly rub oil on them. Half-body plate armor was not like full-body armor, and it was not complicated to wear. A person who knew how to buckle a belt could take care of himself with one hand. Therefore, the Joms pirates quickly put on the armor and rushed to the deck with the weapons that they were used to. Because these people ran too fast, the first mate had to stop two people and ask them to help him carry the real killing machine to the deck. It was a reinforced iron cannon wrapped in leather. He couldn't carry it alone. The sky was just starting to brighten. In order to get enough energy to participate in the celebration at night, most of the residents of West Sea Town were still in bed. Only the hardworking sea merchants would get up early. They were also the ones who noticed the abnormality in the anchorage. Bang! The slow match was pressed into the cap and ignited the hard gunpowder inside. The musket made a muffled sound. Immediately after, thick smoke leaked out from the gap in the barrel, and the bullet whizzed forward. I hit it. The archer immediately bent his waist and quickly hid behind the side of the ship. He roared with excitement and showed off to his companions. But soon, he couldn't laugh anymore. The armed forces of the Xian Feng Chamber of Commerce were like crazy as they desperately rained arrows down on where he was hiding. Originally, this group of people received orders from the master to sneak onto the ship and secretly get rid of the Joms pirates, who had fled to West Sea Town and were suspected to be planning to take advantage of the situation on Inventory Day. But who would have thought that the pirates would be so vigilant? They had just entered the anchorage and were discovered before they could even board the ship. They were even shot from behind. What was even worse was that, coincidentally, the person who shot them in the back had killed their captain with a single shot. He was the cousin of the current head of the Chamber of Commerce, Sangar. Even if they succeeded in their mission, they would probably be severely punished. Therefore, the warriors of the Xian Feng Chamber of Commerce turned their fear into anger and prepared to vent their anger on the Joms pirates. Bang, 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 bang. The arrows shot out from the longbows landed on the deck one after another. The Joms pirates couldn't even lift their heads under the pressure and could only use the side of the ship as a shield to defend themselves. The first rule of survival on the deck: stay away from the mast. Many people looked at the dense rain of arrows falling from the mast and couldn't help but recite the rules of combat silently. This was the tradition of the Joms people. It was useless to be afraid in a battle. The calmer you were when you were risking your life, the higher the chance of survival. This was the precious knowledge they had learned from their parents. If you have cannons, don't be stingy with gunpowder and bullets. Standing at the top of the ship's stern, the first mate finally fixed the leather cannon on the cannon with a chain and yelled at the top of his lungs. This was a sentence he added to the various laws that he had passed down to the people of Yamusi. When the pirates heard this yell, their morale was boosted, and they all roared back in response. The first mate then hid behind his helpers who were holding two large oars, picked up a torch, and lit the fuse on the leather cannon. The gunpowder instantly exploded in the barrel, producing a sound that was 10 times louder than that of a matchlock. A round stone bullet was propelled forward by the explosive force of the gunpowder. Of course, the trajectory of the bullet wasn't always straight. It would eventually land on the ground. The first mate looked through the gap between the two large oars, hoping that he would be lucky. This leather cannon was a new toy that the captain had gotten from King's descends through his connections. He had only fired it a few times and couldn't control the landing point of the bullet well. Fortunately, this shot didn't miss. Even though the stone bullet didn't hit the enemy directly, when it shattered, the stone fragments that flew in all directions caused a few armed members of the Xian Feng Chamber of Commerce to fall to the ground. Chapter 808. Kill those who are cowardly. Even though the Tradewind Merchant Guild had lost their captain, their squad leaders were still around. In the face of the bombardment from the pirate ship, they decisively gave the order to attack. As a few heads fell to the ground, the soldiers who had been frightened by the bombardment immediately perked up as if they had been injected with chicken blood. Then, with all their might, they charged towards the ship. Originally, They had prepared some rope ladders with hooks in order to sneak onto the ship. But now, the sneak attack had turned into a direct attack. The armed forces immediately changed to new climbing tools. They found some knotty gangway ladders in the harbor. These were ladders made by carpenters who had chopped down thick trees, peeled off their bark, sawed them into thick planks, and then tied them together. Other than that, some people found poles that were used when loading and unloading goods. They wanted to use a run-up and pole vault to cross the distance of more than 10 yards and flip onto the deck. Both methods worked. After all, they outnumbered the pirates by at least 3-1. Fighting on a ship docked in the harbor was completely different from fighting on the sea. The Yomians' naval battle techniques were useless. Stand back to back and squeeze them off the ship. The first mate shouted from the top of the ship's stern. He had a helper load the gunpowder for him, while he personally picked up a matchlock gun and fired at a place with a lot of people. In an instant, the deck was overturned. "What's up with that guy?" Naaman looked at the deck from the captain's cabin. He threw the ceramic cup that he used to drink milk tea, accurately hitting a Tradewind Merchant Guild soldier who had been trying to sneak attack the pirates. The ceramic cup smashed into the man's head with a bang, causing him to scream in pain. However, it was quickly drowned out by the increasingly intense sounds of fighting. Keep your eyes open, aim more accurately, and hold the gun more steadily. Naaman turned his head and roared at the first mate and his 2 helpers on top of the stern. Naaman then jumped out of the window of the captain's cabin with his battle axe and landed heavily on the deck. He didn't have the standard half-body plate armor like the other crew members, but he held a combat shield with patterns on it. This fellow, disguised as a Leviathan contract demon, perfectly imitated the traditional battle cries of the pirates of Jorms. He brandished his shield and walked along the side of the ship, leaving himself an unguarded side. Every member of the Tradewind Chamber of Commerce that was hit by his shield was like a leaf that had been swept up by the wind, falling to the deck. After that, Naaman would raise his axe and give the person who fell to the ground a quick death. Bozak. Many of the crew members responded to his shouts at the entrance. They all seemed to have transformed into raging wolves. Swords and sabers were no longer able to fully display their passion for battle. They actually punched, kicked, bit, and used their shoulders. They did everything they could to cause more damage to their enemies. The bloody battle that broke out on the deck not only made the armed members of the Reliance Wind Merchant Association dumbfounded, but also fell into the eyes of the nearby merchant ship owners and sailors. Those guys are definitely pirates of Joms. There are even Joms berserkers among them. Some of the ship owners who traveled the sea all year round were very knowledgeable. They immediately saw through Naaman's identity. The news of Joms pirates attacking West Seatown's port was also quickly sent to Sangar. The family head of the Reliance Wind Merchant Association immediately sent back a new order. No matter the cost, we must annihilate these pirates at the port. We can't let them escape to West Seatown. If the Joms pirates entered the city, this year's Inventory Day celebration would probably be ruined. Not only would the Reliance Wind Merchant Association lose face in front of the traveling merchants, but people might also doubt the safety of West Seatown in the future. Not to mention, according to Sangar's information, the Joms pirates might be related to the big news from 2 days ago in King's Landing City. If the scale of Perpetual Order found out that their ship was docked at West Seatown, not only would the Reliance Wind Merchant Association repair their trade relationship with King's Landing City, it would be a blessing from their ancestors if they were not attacked. That's why the Joms pirates must die, Sangar thought to himself as he looked at the trade representatives who were looking at each other. No matter the cost, we must get rid of this troublesome group as soon as possible. Along with the order of the family head of the Reliance Wind Merchant Association, there were 13 armored warriors and 2 storm servants. The former were powerful warriors raised by the family, while the latter were priests of the Reliance Wind Merchant Association's gods. At this moment, the deck of Naaman's ship had just been cleaned. The cunning Leviathan had already thought of a plan. He ordered the sailors to raise the sails and pretend that they were escaping from the port. This plan fooled the attackers of the Reliance Wind Merchant Association. The 2 storm servants quickly chanted prayers. They cast a divine spell on the raised sails of the ship and summoned strong winds to blow it to the shore. The remaining armed personnel, under the lead of the 13 elite warriors, launched another surprise attack on the ship. This time, the front line of their attack was not limited to the small area of the harbor anchorage. In order to take down the Joms pirates as soon as possible, they used the name of the Reliance Wind Merchant Association to commandeer the ships at the 2 nearby berths. They ordered the owners of the 2 ships to sail close to Nam Min's ship, while the armed forces of the Reliance Wind Merchant Association would attack from both sides. Don't worry about it. Looking at the panicked crew, Nam Min took out a tin cup from nowhere and sipped the rum he got from the first mate's flask. Now, everyone go to the bottom deck and gather. Hurry up, let's move. Soon, the armed forces of the Reliance Wind Merchant Association filled the top deck and gathered at the door to the stern. Because the door was nailed shut by wooden planks and there were a few large barrels of bacon and flour behind it, it was difficult to break open from the outside. The pirates of Joms had already gathered on the lower deck, according to their orders. Every one of them gripped the weapons in their hands tightly as they wondered what their captain was up to. You fat clown, you stink like a pig. Run under the moonlight and jump into the mud dish. Humming a Joms pirate song, Nam Min was the last to arrive at the bottom deck. Everyone, open your mouth and cover your ears. Also, he said slyly, be careful later. Don't bite your tongue. After saying this, Nam Min took the torch from the first assistant's hand. In front of everyone, he single-handedly moved 2 pieces of ballast stone and pulled out a cable wrapped in thick oil paper from the gap. With 2 swishes, he tore off the layer of oil paper and pressed the well-protected inner core with the torch in his hand. It hissed to itself, and several of the seamen, who were adept at handling muskets, realized at once what it was. Chapter 809. The explosive gunpowder mixed with thick smoke and a deafening explosion messed up the entire dock of Shihai Town. The warriors who were squeezed on the top deck were thrown high into the air like fallen leaves in the wind. Then they fell back down heavily. Propelled by the explosion, the Yamshan pirate ship rushed up to the anchorage like a wild horse that had escaped its reins. If it weren't for a few armed warriors desperately trying to save them, the 2 storm servants who were casting spells at the anchorage would have collided with the tall keel of the ship. The Tradewind Merchant Guild suffered heavy losses. None of the armed forces sent by Chingar to kill the pirates could survive this explosion. The berths at the port were damaged and would need to be repaired in the future before they could be used again. What was worse was that the armed forces were stunned and had no time to react to what happened next. Charge! Nam Min yelled at the top of his lungs. He held his shield and axe and led the charge. He was the first to jump out of the hole at the bottom of the ship. When they were preparing for this battle, the explosion points on the bottom deck were set to explode outwards. When the explosion occurred, the broken pieces of the ship didn't cause any harm to the crew gathered there. Instead, they cleared the enemies around them. Once they realized what was going on, they clenched their weapons and followed the captain out of the holes at the bottom of the deck. Naaman would definitely not lead them to their deaths. If that was the case, he would have ordered them to defend the ship with all their might. They would have run for their lives. In order to survive, humans could often explode with unimaginable passion. In addition, the armed forces of the Tradewind Merchant Guild in the port couldn't effectively stop them. These Yomians ran across half of the dock and boarded another ship. They guarded the ship. Get close. Don't let those pirates escape. The 2 storm servants who regained their senses quickly ordered. Of the 13 elite warriors sent by Chingar, only 5 were left. They were busy cleaning up the armed forces that had fallen into chaos. For a moment, the entire dock of Shihai Town was in chaos. The chaos that erupted here quickly spread throughout the city. Puff! Hearing the news from his subordinate, Oak Fist, who had just finished his breakfast and was sipping on his hot tea, tensed up. Luckily, he was not scalded. He spat out all the tea in his mouth and then stood up straight. I'll go to the docks, he said to the mercenary. You go find Mr. Abu and tell him to inform his compatriots. They must, no matter what, convinced the master of the Xian Foam Merchant Guild not to attack that ship. As for the reason, he knows very well. Finishing his words, the lightning monk put on his hood and walked out of the tavern without looking back. He ran straight to Shihai Town's pier. Half an hourglass later, Ablinst, who was not wearing his skeleton disguise, stood in front of a map with his hands clasped behind his back. Many of his followers were gathered on the other side of the hall. Among the dwarves, he was considered tall and had fair skin. He also had a well-groomed black beard. His upper body was relatively thin, like most dwarves. For this meeting, he wore a short coat open in the front, revealing a shirt underneath, the collar of the red shirt rising higher than the coat collar. This was the new fashion of Dwarf Island. This meeting room of the master of the Xian Foam Merchant Guild was covered with a beautiful carpet bought from King's Landing. There was a high table in the corner of the room with a crystal bottle on top of it. It was filled with sweet wine suitable for drinking in the morning. 2 single sofas facing each other were placed in the middle of the room. Ablins did not sit down. The one sitting in the audience seat was a merchant sent by Dwarf Island to Shihai Town. The other seat was prepared for the master of the Xian Foam Merchant Guild, Sangar. If he sat down, not only would it be rude, it would also be a bit rude. So this dwarf investigator had been standing the entire time. During this time, the dwarf merchant invited him to share the large sofa, but Ablin smiled and rejected his kind offer. He said he wanted to admire the scale map of Shihai Town drawn on the wall. My friend, before the person arrived, the voice came first. Hearing the voice in the hallway, Ablinst knew the person in question was here. Building this meeting room was definitely the work of a master architect. It was difficult to hear the conversation inside, but even the slightest sound in the hallway would be amplified several times in this meeting room. It was difficult to not attract the attention of the people in the room. Sorry for making you wait. Today is the trading day, and I was just settling accounts with the trade representatives. You know, merchants have to wait until the accounts are closed before they can enjoy the food and wine in peace. Sangar had a hearty smile on his face. The signature silver-gray hair of the Xian Foam Merchant Guild was tied into a neat ponytail, showing the vigor of a young man without losing his dignity. It was clear that the young master of the Xian Foam Merchant Guild knew there were 2 dwarves waiting for him. He was very familiar with one of them, but Ablinst was a completely unfamiliar face. But he still did not change the furnishings in the room and asked someone to add a sofa. This was his test. Sangar wanted to see who was in charge of this meeting. The result was obvious. The dwarf merchant sitting on the sofa was just a decoration. The real dwarf in the room was the one who had been standing all this time. The 2 of you must be here for the hijacking of the ship. He didn't sit on the sofa. Instead, he leaned his butt against the armrest of the sofa and sat down in a manner that seemed frivolous, but was actually respectful to the dwarf investigator. Then he spoke directly. This is a smart man, Ablins thought, so he did not beat around the bush. On the ship, there are goods that Dwarf Island urgently needs. You can't attack the ship by force. If the bandits are driven to desperation, the consequences will be unimaginable. When he said the last sentence, Ablinstadt emphasized it heavily, and he also looked at Sangar with a firm gaze, telling him that he was not joking. It was a blatant threat. Hearing this, the young master of the Xian Foam Merchant Guild could not help but tremble. He was different from the previous masters who relied on Dwarf Island. After he came to power, he had been trying to build a multipolar business with the purpose of getting rid of the dwarves' control over the Xian Foam Merchant Guild. But Sangar was very good at controlling his emotions. His gaze softened again, and his mind drifted to the hidden meaning of Ablinst's words, the goods that Dwarf Island urgently needs. What was that? Before entering the meeting room, Sangar had done his homework. He read the records of the ship in detail, including but not limited to the tax payment, the previous sailing route, and so on. All these records showed that it was an ordinary ship that traveled between Dwarf Island and West Sea Town. Its main purpose was to transport the steam machine parts produced by Dwarf Island to the Ramsey continent, and then return with berries and food. Is there a famine on Dwarf Island? This was not impossible, but what could a ship's cargo do? Moreover, Before they attacked the ship, the Foam Merchant Guild had promised to compensate the dwarf merchant with a new ship and some goods at a premium. There was definitely something fishy going on. You're tuning into the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.